sure you guys signed in. Make sure you also grab the handout, the purchase contract handout.
And the MLS printout also. And if you have a calendar, it should be like a blank calendar, 2 pages for 2 months.
All right, welcome to Strategies of Purchase Contract with our esteemed principal broker, Tony. Yay! All right.
That's all I get, one clap.
And so what are we going to talk about today? We're going to try to get a better understanding of the purchase contract. So we're going to offer some tips and tricks. We're going to give you some strategies on how to get an offer accepted, how to avoid liability and so forth. And we'll give you some additional resources as well. Please take notes. This is a really good slide to know. You as a professional, you're licensed. It's important for you to take notes. Just like a doctor would take notes with their patient, you're a real estate agent, take notes. We have a fiduciary responsibility to protect our clients. If we don't, we can get a RICO complaint, which we don't even want to mention that word. That's not something we want to do. These kind of classes help you get a better understanding of what you're doing so you can avoid those kind of issues. So we have a fun little thing that we're going to start off with. I begged Tony, I said, can you please make everyone a broker in charge just for today? He said no, but for 20 minutes, you guys all can be brokers. So what we're going to do is you have a purchase contract in front of you. We'd like for you to review the purchase contract and highlight or take notes or circle the things that are wrong as you see it on that purchase contract. So you get to be a bit for a few minutes. Your broker powers only reside in this room, by the way. Don't review anyone else's contracts outside there.
Thank you. And this purchase contract has a particular...
You can keep your broker license.
This purchase contract has an exact closing date on it. So if you take the calendar that you have and just make a note, January, February, that this is a closing date for this contract. It's not 45 days from acceptance. It's a specific date. And we'll go over that as well.
So it's 9:06 now. We'll give you 15 or 20 minutes. That should be more than enough.
Right. You know why that is? Why we always why we change the business days? Does anybody know why? Because we had a situation where the buyer's additional deposit was due on a Saturday, and the seller wanted out of the contract. And he said, if I can't prove that the buyer's deposit went into escrow today, I'm canceling. And they had the right to cancel. That's why it's always business days from now on, or has been for a number of years. Square footages, right? This is the reason why we don't put square footages in, right? It's got 885 square feet. MLS is 659. There was a broker in Maui whose E&O insurance was through the roof. And I had asked him one day, I said, why is your E&O insurance so high? Why is your deductible so high? He told me of a story of where it was the wrong square footage in the purchase contract. The buyer thought he was getting, say, 1,000 square feet. All he was getting was 700. And the guy lost about $75,000 on a claim. So that's the reason why we don't put square footages in there at all. And then plus the tax records are never really always correct either. How about offer to buy, AM and PM? Yeah. How about on page 2? I'm sorry, page 3 of 14.
Got to mark NA for all the items you don't have.
Good one.
Branch off to escrow,
Okay, scheduled closing date. Everybody look at their calendar. What day does that fall on? So this is going to be important later on.
Friday.
The 24th?
Monday.
Monday. All right. Keep that in mind for a little bit later. How about page 14?
Page.
I'm gonna start, put page 4. You can tell I don't really teach, right? You can tell I don't like coming up here.
Assessments.
Okay.
That's 8. So, it's 8, like you wouldn't want to do that. You're selling, right?
Well, here's the thing about assessments, right? The verbiage in the contract just says either the buyer assumes them or the seller pays them off, okay? But I'm gonna tell you, the way the contract is written, the way that it was written for the board is not clear. And we've had this argued through separate attorneys on 5 different occasions where neither attorney could agree that the assessments had to be taken over by the buyer or they had to be paid off by the seller. So from now on, what you guys are gonna have to do, this particular unit, and this happened a couple of months ago. It says special assessment. The selling agent said that his client was on the board of the association, and that it wasn't really an assessment of $163 a month. It was more like a loan that was being repaid back. But if you take a look at RO 105, see, it said assessment. And then you start arguing about, well, what is the meaning of an assessment? So from now on, if you have an MLS that says special assessment, call the property management company, find out what the monthly payment is, confirm it, and what the total amount is, and put it in section Q. Seller shall pay the assessment of $163 per month, which equals $45,000 at the close of escrow.
So when you find it out from the HOA, then obviously confirm that when you get the RO 105 and those documents back as well.
Anything on page 5?
Sorry, for F8, what then you would check seller and seller?
Well, even though you check seller, just because you check it doesn't mean the seller's gonna pay for it. Because what just happened, they argue, oh, it's not an assessment, it's a loan that we're repaying. It's still an assessment. So by the time you get to that point, it's kind of hard to argue back and forth when you look at the close. So get it taken care of up front. If they're not going to pay an assessment, you want to know on a counter offer, then you can tell your buyer they're not willing to pay the special assessment. Either find another property or you're willing to pay $45,000 more for the property.
So in other words, if you call and you find out that there is an assessment when you're writing the contract, not only should you put on here that the seller should pay for it, but you should also add that language to section Q.
And with the amounts.
What would be the language in Q?
Seller agrees to pay off the special assessment in the amount of $45,000 in full at the close of escrow.
Would it be better to leave that term assessment out if they're arguing that it's not an assessment?
No, because you're gonna have to argue at some point in time anyway, right? Take it up front, because that's what happened. That's exactly what happened, was like a week before closing, and unfortunately the buyer wanted the property and I was spending, the additional assessment, which in this case was only about maybe $7,000 or $8,000.
Well, the discrepancy is that the seller saying it's not an assessment, whatever that is. So by putting the term assessment in Q, they may argue that it's not an assessment, it's a loan.
Yeah, but if you take a look at the RO 105C, it said assessment. Maintenance fees are assessment. Property taxes are an assessment. A loan assessment, whatever it is, it's something that's tagged onto the property. Anything on page 5?
So what about G3? 15 days will take place after the closing date.
G3?
That's acceptance date.
Excuse me. Yeah, G3.
Yeah. That's fine.
H1A.
It should be an X, right?
Where?
H1A. Anything wrong on 6?
shorter days for the I-1 seller.
Good job, Tiff. Did everyone hear what she said? No. Should have shorter times on I-1 and I-2. I-1, I-2, so I-1 is initial disclosure. I-2 is an amended disclosure by the seller. So I'll say this too, is like attorneys, real estate agents sometimes give contrary advice depending on who we're representing, or representing the seller or representing the buyer. So in this case, in this forum, we're talking about representing a buyer. So these dates and these timeframes should be a little bit shorter because they benefit the buyer. So the thought process is, well, let me ask you a question. Why would I want the initial disclosure? Why would we want that less than 7 days? So it's written as 7 days. Why would we want it less than 7 days?
Identify any issues up front.
Maintenance with MJ1.
Yeah, those are all good answers. The other one too is when you get the SRPS, you want to be able to review it in full and thoroughly, make some notes on it, maybe make some highlights, ask some additional questions to the listing agent, but also provide that SRPS to your home inspector so that they can pay closer attention to certain problem areas that might be recurring or what have you. Also, why would you want I-2 a shorter date? So this one is 7 days. It doesn't seem, on the surface, it's kind of benign. It doesn't seem that long, right? But what if you're 5 days out from closing and something happens? So we'll go over like all the actual dates and what you should put in there when we get these slides. So what do you guys see, if any, on page 8? 8 of 14, any issues there?
J4.
Say again, Jeff? So note too that the purchase contract and the timeframes and dates, they all kind of work together. They're not independent of one another. So we just spoke about I-1, right? Do you see an issue with I-1 being 7 days and J1 being 5 days? That's an issue, right? That should kind of chronologically flow together a little bit. But in addition, depending on the age of the property, why would we ever want J1 to be 5 days? Anything else that's wrong with page 8? Sean, I know you want to say something.
J4.
Okay. What about J4?
15 days after closing seems excessive.
No.
Why?
Why wouldn't you put closing date instead of 15?
That's a great question. So why?
I would definitely not, I would put it closing date. It must be closed and.
Well, there's two schools of thought on that, but let's go back to J3. What's the problem with 3 days prior to closing, doing your final walkthrough?
There's not enough.
What's the scheduled closing date fall on? What day of the week? Monday. You do your final walkthrough inspection on a Thursday or Friday. Do you have time to react?
No.
Why is that?
The weekend.
But what else besides being a weekend? The loan is funded already. It's already at the Bureau of Conveyances for recording on Monday. You cannot pull it. So in this case, that's where you want J4 to be 15 days. Because we just had a situation where something came up in the J3 inspection. It was repaired, but it wasn't repaired properly. And now the property already closes. And the repair needs to be a lot more than what the initial repair is. So now you can't really go back. You can ask the seller to go back and, hey, you didn't really fix it right, or that wasn't really the problem. But if you don't have any recourse to go back to them, the J4 comes in. Otherwise, what do you tell your buyer? Get an attorney. Or come out of pocket and fix like a broken drain line or something like that, right?
Sean?
With that verbiage of 3 days, it says, the final walkthrough no later than 3 days, so we could do it 5 days or a couple days before.
But how many people do that?
Because because you also got to think too, on the list side, when you get the contract and you're representing the seller and you accept that and create that timeline, you're backing into those dates too. So you're like, okay, we don't have to be out by this date, we don't have to think by this date, we don't have to. So can you request it? Sure. If it's vacant, that might work out. But if it's occupied, you might get a no. Then they might come back and say, well, it's not in the timeline. That's not how you work the contract.
Based on final walkthrough, are you able to cancel the contract because like the property doesn't look?
Too late.
That's a great question, actually.
In this scenario, it's a little bit too late.
So what's the remedy? Let's say that there's something wrong when you do the final walkthrough. It could be something very minute, like there's a broken glass or tile missing or something detrimental. What is the remedy in that situation? Okay, that's an answer. What, is there anything else, or is that the answer?
You get an estimate, I hear what you said, ledger, and then
She said update the SRPS, and then Zeus.
you submit an estimate, take that to escrow, they hold funds
What?
until it's either fixed or it's paid by someone.
Okay, so he's saying an escrow holdback. Is there any other guesses?
Yeah, ask for some cash.
Ask for cash. Briefcase or paper bag?
Money to fix the problem.
Sure.
Burn the-
Any other? So it is an escrow holdback, but that's your remedy. So the point that Tony was making too is depending on the timeline of things, 3 days falling on a weekend is escrow's not even open, so you can't even initiate that. You can't even kind of stop the train, so to speak. It's already left the station. So it's really important to understand the time frames and giving yourself enough room to maneuver to be able to have a remedy to protect the buyer.
So maybe instead of 3 days, write 5, write 4. Give yourself 1 or 2 extra days. Always anticipate a problem, expect the worst case scenario for anything that comes up, and hopefully it doesn't happen that way.
Why would you say the closing date not on the date, we should always close on?
Well, because people say 35 days after the acceptance date, right? That may fall on a Monday.
But they don't look at what the date.
They don't look at the date, right? And I did this purposely so that you know. Because some people in here, are brand new, you may not know that your documents go to escrow 48 hours before, that your loan is already funded.
Yeah.
What's the best day to close of the week?
Friday. You got plenty of time for like full recording. As long as you do your inspections way ahead of time. You can negotiate anything as long as you have enough time. You can ask for an extension, you can ask for, and this is why, like, if you're representing the buyer, like, in the seller's real property disclosure, you kind of want to give your buyer a lot of time to review the updated disclosure, because it may be something like a huge problem that you don't really know about, right? But if you give him like 2 days to review the updated disclosure, it's not enough time for him to say, get a plumber, get an electrician to find out what the severity of the problem is. Or maybe the house shifted from when you put an offer in until you got to your J3 inspection, right? I mean, all those things can come up. Like I said, anticipate the worst, expect the best. And don't be afraid to pull the plug. Advise your buyer, like, this is a severe problem. I suggest that you cancel.
Okay, page 9 of 14, any issues that you found there?
Yeah.
A1.
It wouldn't need staking?
It's not necessary.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just for instance, if it were a single family home, would it be okay to have K1 check?
I want to K2.
Why wouldn't you want K1? What report? Is that important, the survey report? What does a survey report reveal or tell a potential buyer? Encroachments, easements. Anything on page 10?
Wait, going back, in a single family home situation, is there ever a situation where K1 and K2 would be required to recommend that?
K2 has the staking as part of that. I asked this question to the board. K1 is typically used on outer islands, not a lot. Because in some areas you can't get some of those encroachments in rural areas, like on the Big Island, for instance. So for all intents and purposes here on this island, when we're doing it, if it's a single family home, you're gonna want to click or check on K2, not K1. That's a great question. Anything on page 10 that you guys? Okay. So what happens in that scenario if it's $100? Did anyone read the? So you can get it, right? But it could be detrimental to to one party or the other, depending on how it's written. Okay. Anything on page 11?
And 1 and 2.
Can I ask a question about L2? What do you write? Do you write actual amount?
Actual cost.
Cost, or do you
Yeah.
write an amount, a dollar amount? What do you write?
I do actual cost.
I do actual costs as well.
Because it's kind of like, you know, you don't want to have to go back to your buyer and say, hey, I just calculated a termite inspection. You got to come up with an extra $500 to close it.
Anything on page 12?
Regarding termite, we have a situation between contracts. The termite inspector was cousin to the owner, the buyer. And then he, or the seller actually tried to give him the termite inspection, and he inflated the price of the termite inspection. So I personally put this, I called the termite inspector, and asked him exactly how much he charged.
Good point.
Anything on page 13?
11? 11 should be L1 or L2.
Yes.
One, two, three, check.
Special terms.
Just the language.
I'm sorry, say again?
Special terms, there is just numbers, 1, 2, should be.
So you're saying like the formatting of the special terms. Okay, so he's saying it would just said 1 and 2 versus Q1, Q2 as per the contract, the instructions. What else?
For Q2, you need evidence of the next best offer within a specified period of time.
Okay, so it's lacking some of the language.
A lot of it.
So Zeus is saying it's lacking some verbiage and language in there. Brittany said, what do you say? There's no ceiling, there's no cap.
Ceiling.
Those are good points.
Actually, both are correct. I don't want a ceiling. Right? You don't want to obligate your buyer to pay more for the property than he can really afford. And I've had agents come to me a lot and say, I don't want to show my buyer's hand in the contract. If your buyer can, all you're showing is that your buyer can't afford any more than a certain price. You're not showing anything. So why go through the whole process of your buyer winning the contract, only to have to cancel because he can't qualify for the mortgage?
What about number 1, or what would be Q1? Sean?
Things for Q1 as far as how long, what is subject to provide the building package, as well as if for the buyer to go to review it.
Good job.
Good job.
Did everyone hear what he said? So one thing that was not illustrated in Q1 is when the buyer is going to receive it, how long it takes for the seller to provide that information. And also, and equally as important, is how long the buyer has to review it and potentially terminate based on section O of the contract, depending on which section it is. If ever there's a clause in there that you're asking the seller to provide something, you got to have an opportunity for the buyer to review it and then cancel.
I put the career building permit.
That's right. Yeah. So it depends on which one. There are different types as well. So you got to be specific as to which one you're looking for. So good point.
I want to go back to N1 and N2. And this is something that I did a deal with, an attorney representing a party that was subject to court confirmation, and he brought up a good point. N1 really only pertains to property if it has tenants in it. So what he told me, and what I now use is on the closing date, aside from on or before or 35 days after the closing date, I insert in there that the property should be free and clear of all occupants. Because the last thing you want is on the day of recording to have your seller or the seller on the other side say, "Oh, I didn't know how to get out by closing day." And you've already recorded. And I've seen it happen.
Can you repeat the verbiage you're using?
Property to be free and clear of all occupants.
And you put that in Q?
No, I put that on
So we would
F2.
notate that.
F2.
Thank you.
So when it says like, where it says concession.
Because there's always confusion too about closing day, right? Closing day, like in New York, like you sign your documents the same day that you get possession of it, right? Over here, it's kind of like, well, when is closing? Is closing when I sign? Is closing when I recorded? When do I have to get out?
I have a question on page 12. For all three, shouldn't it be 7 days?
It depends. I mean, 7 days is the max, right? But do you really want to give the other party like an extended period of time to go ahead and cancel you out?
I thought the attorney for Bill Williams had recommended to do 7 days. Do you remember? He was told?
Well, it depends.
That's what he was.
It depends on who you're representing.
So if we represent the buyer, right? This is a contract or not? Yeah.
Well, it depends on what your buyer wants. That's the whole thing, right? Like everything that's in here, it really depends on what your buyer wants. If I'm representing the seller, I don't want to give the buyer 7 days to go ahead and cancel the contract. I don't want him stringing me along. On the other side too, is if I'm the buyer, I don't want to give the seller 7 days to like go ahead and push me out thinking that I'm moving forward. I've already paid for my appraisal and home inspection and everything else, and I've got costs involved.
So what do you recommend?
I put 3. I do a short time frame, especially with some of the time frames in here, right? Because I see contracts come in with 30 days. 30 days for closing. That's really tight.
Whether you're on the buy side or the sell side.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, so long as you're asking yourself and asking the buyer, of course, the question of what their goals and priorities are and how you're trying to help them succeed that goal and priority, everything else should fall into place. It's not a template. You can't use a purchase contract in a template form because it's not curating that, customizing that document for their benefit.
I mean, tight timelines are okay until there's a problem.
Okay, so we've taken away all of your honorary broker statuses now. You can't review any more contracts except for Bill.
I got a question.
Yeah.
With regards to moving out, if you're advising on the sell side, I usually have them move out a day or two before cleaning, so that they're not living in it after cleaning it. Because that became an issue one time. Is that also, because then they may argue and say, well, we're not recording till X day, why do I have to move out? So is that what you guys do?
Well,
Can you repeat the question?
the question had to do with cleaning. Like, when do you get the property cleaned? Do you get it cleaned before the final inspection, before the seller moves out? How about saving yourself a headache, getting the quote for the cleaning, and then just giving a credit? Then it becomes up to the buyer and the cleaners. And if they don't clean well, it falls on the buyer. Hey, you hired these guys.
The other thing too is just expectation. Just like when you're doing a buyer consultation, you're doing a listing presentation, you're consulting with your client, you just lay out the expectation. These are the timelines. This is the date that you need to exit the property, this is when we're gonna move your items, this is when we're gonna clean, this is when the final walkthrough is taking place. I mean, that's literally a conversation that should be had as well.
Going back to Susan's question with the owners, hasn't the contract been revised without the owners staying in the property to the actual closing date?
Well, they have the right to.
Yeah, and they just added that in there with the revision.
Well, it's getting revised again, so.
So that's a problem with, that I see with the cleaning. But you get a cleaning and just go in there.
Right, that's why I said just give it credit, right? Depends on the circumstances.
Okay, so let's go through the contract. One thing that I thought was a very appropriate thing that Colette, Trina, our operating control, has said before is, if you are unwilling to learn, no one can help you, but if you are not willing to learn, no one can stop you. No, that's not right. If you are willing to learn. So the whole point of this is there's a lot of ways to write the contract, a lot of strategies that you can employ. There's certainly a wrong way to do it. There's multiple right ways to do it. At the end of the day, just make sure that you understand the strategy, but also understand the language that's in the contract as to why you would do certain things. You can't just put a number because someone else is like, use that. Well, what does that mean exactly? And how does it impact? Because a lot of these dates in here is a double-edged sword. So when you extend that benefit to your buyer, you also in turn extend that same benefit to the seller. So we're going to go over some of that strategy right now. So you have that contract in front of you. You've taken some notes and highlighted a couple of things. Tony and I are going to give you some strategies, some tips, some things to avoid or stay within. Joe, if you have any suggestions or experience, please let us know that you can chime in as well. Joe has a ton of experience as well. So here's a tip. Should be something that you guys do no matter what is before you write an offer, call the listing agent and ask the following questions. Do you have any offers in hand? And if so, how many offers and how strong are those offers? Why would you even ask that question, by the way? Yeah, absolutely. Know if you're competing.
That's escalation clause.
That's right. He said potential escalation clause, which is perfect. When are you presenting offers to the seller? Why is that important? Expiration date, that's exactly right. Besides the price, what's important to the seller? Why would you ask that question?
The clarity.
Clarity, sometimes the terms decided, that's absolutely right. I've had a couple of scenarios before where people in their mind think, I'm going to write it as fast as possible, to close as quick as possible, I'm just going to shoot that offer off. But when you call, you find out maybe it's a military family, they don't need 30 days, they prefer 60. Or there's some sort of other kind of timeline term that no other agent had called to find out. So my offer wasn't maybe the strongest offer because I wrote it to accommodate the seller, even though it still fit the goals and priorities of the buyer.
It's kind of adding to that, but before writing an offer, we send off a template email with those exact questions. That kind of advises us on how to format.
Yeah. So Zeus says that before he writes the offer, he sends out an email. It's a template email asking these specific questions so he knows how to formulate and write that offer. So those are great strategies. Anything else that people would ask ahead of time? Rustin, you had a question? I saw you raising your hand.
I did. I was just asking like this. I'm just kidding.
Okay, so now that you have the information, what do you do with it? So you've asked a series of questions. It could be just these things. To Zeus, to Zeus's point, you could have had an email and a bunch of other things. What do you do next? Discuss it with a buyer. Yeah. Anything with that? Nope. So on page 2 of 14, here's a tip. Earnest money deposits are a great way to negotiate a contract. It is one of the few components that show the strength of an offer, but instead of having the buyer put down $10,000 on the initial deposit, for example, you might want to consider putting down $2,500 and $7,500 as a secondary, or $5,000, $5,000. So out of curiosity, why would you do that? So at the end of the day, right, it's still $10,000 that you're putting down in earnest. In this market, in this state, you can split it up into two, initial deposit and a secondary deposit. If our goal, per the strategy that we discussed with our buyer and how we're going to write that offer, is to have a $10,000 total initial deposit or combined deposit, why would you want to split it up? So say again?
Division of liability.
Division of liability. Any other answers? It's because he used big words. He just stopped all other answers.
That's not big words.
No, that's right. It's because if you put money, Kimo Stone is one who always would say, if you put money into escrow, you got to be prepared to not get that back, because at the end of the day, the buyer may not get that back for a variety of reasons, right? So you want to try to minimize the risk as much as possible. And also too, if you're not competing with anyone, why have such a large deposit? If they would accept something smaller, and if you're not competing, I probably wouldn't have a secondary deposit either. So yeah, absolutely right. So who determines the structure and the amounts of the earnest money? Tip who? The buyer. Yeah, I mean, we can help give them some examples and how to structure things or what have you, but they are the principal, and we have fiduciary responsibility to them. So we're going off of what their goals and priorities are. God forbid you tell them what to do, and they don't. I've been in this situation before. Helping other newer agents, they get so excited, they'll put $10,000 because they're trying to compete with something. They didn't even ask the buyer didn't have $10,000 in the first place. So it's not good to start off the escrow like that.
Oh, Chad, regarding VA, we've customarily done 1,000 initial, 1,000 secondary, and then had it credited back at closing. Is that what's recommended for most people? If they're doing it?
Yeah, there's nothing wrong. So his question was, if you structure a VA loan, what's one of the benefits of a VA loan? 100% financing, right? So if you don't know any better on how to structure that, sometimes you think, oh, there's no earnest money that's needed. But we need, to make a valid contract, one of the components is consideration. So consideration is the money part of it, and that's the earnest money, right? So we put it in, typically it's $1,000, but I would say too, though, that in my experience, you can use $1,000. You can also use another $1,000 for a secondary deposit, probably up to maybe about $650-ish. And then afterwards, even though it's VA, and even though you can still get 100% financing afterwards, you kind of have to go with the price point too, right? So if it's $750, you might want to make that initial deposit $2,500. You know, you can get VA. Does anyone know? Can you use a VA loan to purchase a property at $2 million?
Yes. Right now, it's your first year use.
So if you buy a property that's $2 million using a VA loan, should you use $1,000 earnest money?
No.
It depends. I mean, there's no right answer. The answer is it kind of depends, right? Because if you're not competing with anything, then sure, why not? Because you're minimizing the risk and liability of your buyer. But if there's other offers that are coming in, you're going to probably want to increase that to be within reason of what that purchase price is. Okay. On page 2, C1, make sure there's a time with AM, PM, and appropriate time. So I think it's in the contract, but no problem with putting PM and Hawaiian Standard Time. C2, when using additional deposits, use language like 2 business days after J1 satisfaction. If you're using that secondary deposit, do not use 2 biz days. Why would you not use? Russell, what was that? That's not a word. You know, you almost have to operate, because we're dealing with contracts, and you almost have to operate as though if you're sitting in front of a judge and jury, what would happen, right? They're going to look at you like you might be a little bit incompetent because of how you're writing that. That's not an actual word, you know. So I know sometimes people do it as a shortcut. It fits in there. Trust me, I write mine like that, so it all fits. D1, if something is not applicable, do not leave it blank. The purchase contract requires you to enter NA in the space provided. So I've seen this all the time. I'm sure that you guys have seen that, where you'll see a purchase contract in dual agency. If it's appropriate, it's checked. VA might be checked, but everything else is blank. It clearly states, right, NA is not applicable. So follow the instructions of the contract. Yes?
Let's see, depending on you, the buyer or seller, when I represented the seller, the buyer came and said that additional deposit after, so the language is there, except they don't use satisfaction, they say expiration date.
Yeah, that's, so what I'm saying is, like I mentioned before, there's a wrong way to do something. There's multiple right ways. There's nothing wrong with that. This is just me, so you don't have to do what I do, but I prefer to just have extreme clarity on what I'm doing. And the expiration date or the satisfaction and expiration is two different things, right? So expiration just means that you have 10 days, and if it's 2 days after expiration, then it's on the 12th day that is going to be deposited. I prefer writing it at satisfaction, because if we're moving forward and they agree to sign off on J1 7 days into the 10 days, then that means they're going to deposit that a little bit earlier. So I prefer to write it as satisfaction, but there's no wrong. Do you have any input on that?
I like satisfaction.
So as a seller, they want after satisfaction period, depending on the J1 period too. So if you represent the seller, buyer says expiration, can you count?
Yeah, you can counter anything. I mean, you don't want to.
Recommend to counter, right?
On our team, we counter almost every single contract that comes in, because first of all, they don't know how we write contracts. I think we're pretty good at writing contracts, but also if the contract, if it's written in the right spirit of things, if you're on the list side, you get a contract coming in, if that contract is written in the spirit it's supposed to be written in, it's protecting who? The buyer. So if I'm on the list side, it's probably not going to favor or benefit the seller typically. So when you look it over, there's going to be things on there like, oh, I'm okay with this, but I'm really not okay with that. Just by its very nature, in preparing a counter, you're looking out for your client, you're looking out for the seller. Rest of the
I believe what Vicky is saying is there's two, with the word satisfaction and the word approval, there's two. One has a fixed date, the other has a floating date.
Yes, that's right.
Satisfaction, you can have earlier deposits put in there if you're satisfied at 7 days.
Yeah. Whereas expiration is just built into the contract as a fixed date as rest of those. Jan?
Just from experience, I don't know if I would recommend anybody accepting J1 prior to the expiration of it. Has anybody ever changed their mind? And if they change their mind after they say, yeah, I'm okay, and then you accept the J1, who are they going to point their finger at? Because the contract didn't require them to do that.
So what he's saying, and this is a kind of a standard on the team too. So let's say there's a 10-day J1. In theory, if you've done everything in the right timeline, and you should have had the home inspection done in like 2 or 3 days, right? You're doing that right away. So let's say it's super clean, everything is great. What Dan's saying is, why would you sign off on it on day 3? Just let that thing, if you're on the buy side, you want to let that thing ride out. Yeah,
At the end of the 7 days, does that mean the buyer's already accepted it anyways?
At the end of 7 days.
Of the J1, so the J1 has a period, right? Whatever that period is.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of that, if the buyer doesn't say anything, let's say he goes away with the same thing, it's automatically accepted.
So
Automatically accepted, correct.
Yeah. So
That's why it's important to pay attention to timelines and what the cancellation options are. Because if you blow past a deadline, you committed either your buyer or seller. And what I've seen happen is that, oh, the buyer hasn't done this, but the seller didn't do this first. And I'm like, it doesn't really matter. It's not tit for tat, right? It's kind of like if you blow past your J1 inspection and your buyer didn't want it and you cancel it, then you're going to have an issue. And you have to look for something else to go ahead and cancel, and you may not get that opportunity, right? And the other thing too is that when there are problems with a J1 and you're negotiating either a credit or some repairs, does the seller have to give them to you? And so what are your buyer's options?
We'll separate cancel.
Right.
Understand.
But does the seller have to give you an extension?
No, sir.
No.
I would say that in my experience, most of the cancellations that happen in escrow are happening due to the findings of the home inspection, which is the J1 period. Right? Would you guys have similar experience to that? So I hear this a lot. I'll check in with agents that I've looked at their contracts or whatever, and they'll say, J1 is ending tonight at midnight, and I say, well, what are you going to do? And the buyer wants a repair or they want a credit. And they said, well, I sent an email over to the other agent, so we should be okay. What would be wrong with that? What if that other agent said, don't worry, they emailed back and said, don't worry, the seller said he'll fix, that light or that leak or.
It's not in writing.
It's not a writing from the seller.
So what should you do? Well, if you're stuck in, let's say that you know the answer. The answer is, as Tony alluded to, if you represent the buyer, you really have two choices for the buyer, which is to accept it or to cancel the contract. So you're still within your J1 period. J1 ends tonight at midnight. So what should you do if the buyer says, hey, listen, I want these items repaired, or I want a credit, or I don't know that I want to move forward.
To wait for an answer, extend it.
But they're not responding. So the listing agent's not responding at all. What should you do? But they're not responding. But my point is that listing agent's not responding. You guys have all been through this before, I'm sure, that listing agents, there are some great agents and there's some agents that kind of play that game because they know that if you pass that time frame and it goes into tomorrow, what happens is you allowed your buyer to acquiesce, right? You just move right past that. Is that the word of the day? So one strategy that I've used is I've sent over a cancellation and I've CC'd escrow. I sent it to the listing agent and all the listing agents team and so forth. With the police buyer executed the cancellation agreement along with the J1 request for repairs. And I said, you haven't responded, but we intend to cancel this by midnight. Now, should the seller decide to cancel or to apply this credit or agree to this credit, sign and send it back to us, then please consider this cancellation rescinded. But the point is, I reserve that right to cancel. I've already sent that out within that time frame because tomorrow it doesn't count anymore.
In that cancellation request, do you have to put in there the verbiage of it being rescinded if?
No, I would put that in the email, but the cancellation, you want to leave it kind of untainted, which is just, buyer elects to cancel based upon their rights to do so via J1.
What about, what do you think about a cancellation provision right in the J1, right? Buyer request, these repairs, if seller does not respond by the end of the J1 inspection period, this contract is thereby canceled.
Yeah.
That way you don't have to wait for your buyer to but then you're kind of sitting at your computer, do I cancel it, do I not cancel it, right? And then the buyer's well, you didn't cancel it, so now I'm obligated. And you can say well, you were supposed to tell me you're going to cancel it. And the only reason why I say that because I got into a situation where I got sued. And the client said to me, oh, we'll be friends after this. Well, that was out the door, from day one. Right? So don't trust anything that your client says. And I'm just telling you from experience, right? Just protect yourself. If it's something that you want to get through and it needs to be canceled, write it in the J1, so your buyer knows up front and then you can go to sleep at midnight.
The flip side to that too is you don't want to exercise the cancellation without explaining it to the buyer to let them know that, okay, when I send this out, they could be playing a game because they might have another offer. Who knows what's going on? So by sending this out, they literally could go, okay, cancellation accepted, and then move on to something else. So you don't want to act on your own. You're representing the buyer, so you need to understand and explain to them, here's the pros and cons, here's a strategy, which one would you like us to use, and here's the benefit of that.
Okay.
Yes?
So did you say that you would send the cancellation signed by the buyer along with the J1 request and tell the agent, we didn't hear from you by midnight, we're canceling it, so you will send the document to.
I've done that, and I don't do that every time because, again, it's case by case. It depends on what that dialogue and scenario is that I'm dealing with on the other side. I've done that a handful of times. Every single time it's worked to success, but the reason why I don't do it that often is because I have a clear line of communication with the other side for the entire transaction. So they're not surprised when they get that because I told them that. I said, well, we do have the right to cancel, so I'm just letting you know I'm not hearing back. So it's a build-up to that. So they already know that I'm serious and we might have to go that route. Rustin?
With this in mind, it's important that pages, make sure they plan their timelines out accordingly. And if you want to give at least a 2 or 3 day review period of the contract and requests made, that means your code inspection has to be done before that scheduling. Like, this is not, let's wait till the last minute.
Absolutely.
They're squeezing their butt cheeks and everything can come out.
Yeah, that's a great point, Rusty. And by the way, too, use a transaction coordinator. I know one. Hold on, there's a really good one. Sherelle at Core is really, really good. You have to use a transaction coordinator. It just helps with your timeline, making sure you should focus on what you're good at. And what you're good at is selling real estate. Let her focus on what she's good at, which is the timeline and making sure all the contracts and all the dates match and so forth. Okay.
Chad, regarding,
yes.
D1, for standard addendums, if you represent the seller and you get like a Coldwell Banker standard addendum, in the counter, you should remove that and add ours.
Here's what I would recommend, and Tony chime in too, but what I would recommend is if you're on the list, so his question was, if you're on the list side and someone writes a contract and they include, which they typically would, we do the same thing, right? They include their own firm's standard addendum, Coldwell's or whatever, Berkshire Hathaway. What should you do? So my answer would be, what I do is I counter that out and I insert ours in its place. You have a little bit more leverage. Because this is a seller's market, right? So if you represent the seller, you have a little bit more leverage. Now, with that said, at the end of the day, we want to go into escrow. So the other thing is read it. I don't know why you just don't read it, because some of that language you want to remove, or some of those addendums and documents you want to remove, because the language in there is detrimental to the buyer. It'll say things like, we're not going to pay for TIR regardless of what the findings of the term of inspection are, or things like that that you might not even realize when you explain, when you had your buyer consult, because I know you've all had a buyer consult with your buyers and explain the purchase contract and their rights and so forth. Some of those addendums try to eliminate or remove some of the language that's built into the purchase contract to protect that buyer.
But homes and gardens are like that. They remove land, like they've inserted language in there, then in case they do find termites, what the obligations are, they change it from the original contract. So you want to be aware of that. Our standard addendum really is just all about disclosure to the buyer.
So conversely, though, if you're representing the buyer submitting your standard addendum, if you get counter from the seller with their eliminating ours, adding theirs, and has verbiage in there, you should then counter number 2.
Well, this is what I would say. I would say that, again, it depends on the goals and priorities of the buyer. So I would read that addendum. I would say, hey, Mr. Buyer, we sent this over with our addendum. They've counter back and inserted theirs. Let's sit down and discuss what theirs says. And then if you would like to review it further, please have your attorney review it.
But most of the bigger firms, their language is pretty much the same as ours. Well, kind of like cut and paste each other's, contracts, addendums like that, right? But I know like Better Homes and Garden has specific language that they altered with
I think it's
termites.
And also J1, I think they have if the findings of the home inspection automatically.
Yeah, automatically is an update to the seller's disclosure.
Which is not.
Yeah. Now, I should know this, but on our standard addendum, does it have?
I love how you started that.
Huh?
I should know this.
But does our standard addendum have verbiage in there that says it supersedes anything or supersedes the purchase contract?
So here's a rule of thumb. Anything that is added supersedes anything that's already in the contract.
Hey, by the way, too, I can tell you if, let's say that you're on the buy side, you send in the offer, you include our standard addendum, they counter back, removing our standard addendum, inserting their standard addendum, right? If the buyer, you've explained it to the buyer, for the most part, they're okay with generally the language of their addendum. Maybe it's a 2-page document, but they just don't like that one thing. Maybe it's a termite thing or whatever. If it's a new property, the risks are a little bit minimal. But if the property was built in 1950s and it's all wood house in town or whatever, that's a risk. So in discussing with your buyer, and the buyer said, I'm okay with everything else, I'm just not okay with that. You can have a counter back. You don't have to remove, so to make them feel better, you don't have to remove their entire document, but you can do a strike through for that paragraph or that portion of their addendum.
Do
You can, but
so then which one supersedes what?
some have language, not all, but some of the firms' addendum, I don't think ours has that language, but some firms' addendums have language that say, in a situation where there's a conflict, ours supersedes any other firm's addendum.
I'm just kidding, I'm just kidding.
You go back to the drawing board, right?
Yeah, you gotta worry.
That's a perfect answer right there. Ask an attorney. So you get 3 different answers from 3 different attorneys.
Technically, for science class.
So here's a tip for writing an offer. You know, there's, again, this is not a right or wrong thing, it's just something that I've done in the past and I've had some success with it. If you're competing with other offers in a VA situation or maybe a USDA or FHA, sometimes those buyers, the first-time home buyers, are kind of maxed out. One thing that I've done is I've written slightly over the asking price. And I've done that with success, and the reason why is because if that listing agent is following the rules and being ethical, I would like to think that most are. If another person is asking that agent, hey, do you have any offers in hand? The answer they're going to give is yes, we have an offer in hand, it's over asking. So when you hear that as a buyer's agent, you think, oh man, that's probably like 20 or 30,000 over. I might not write the offer. There are lazy agents out there, by the way. But I've done that with success, and I've only written in $500 to $1,000 over. Now, if the buyer really wants it, it's either an all-cash deal, or if it's, this is in the situation where they're kind of maxed out, and you're just trying to see if there's anything else that you can squeeze out. At the end of the day, $1,000 on a mortgage is nothing, and it's likely not going to impact or affect the appraisal as well. So, on E2, this is on page 3 or 14. If something is not applicable,
Yes.
What would you recommend on G1 as in the on G1 that probably doesn't really matter?
I'm sorry, you're trying to say that again?
The as in
If you could include it or not?
well, when you're representing a buyer and you want to include it, and you're representing a seller or seller too, you want to include it. Most times we just automatically include it. But what your recommendation is, what would it be? Should we automatically include it or?
So let me ask this question. So who would the as-is addendum favor if, which party, if any?
Seller.
And why is that?
Selling house as is, no restriction.
So,
But it only so complicated.
But can the buyer still go back and ask for repairs?
Yes.
can the buyer cancel based on the results of the home
Yes.
inspection?
Yes.
Always, yeah. So it's really, to me, it's really a kind of a buyer beware disclosure. So to your point is when you write an offer, you don't have to include that in there if you're representing the buyer. On our listings, when we put it on there, we actually put on there, please include pre-approval letter, as is addendum. We're obviously protecting the seller, not the buyer, right? So it depends. You don't have to include it. You may be countered and then include it, but at the end of the day, it's really a disclosure. I don't know that the seller doesn't have to repair anything anyways.
The representing a buyer, you should do automatically put it.
That's fine.
That.
Yeah, that's fine.
And here's the other thing too, the language of the as-is goes inside of the deed. So I don't know if you know that, right?
Sorry.
The as-is language goes inside of the deed of transfer, which means is that if there's something wrong after closing, as long as fraud is not involved, the buyer absolutely cannot go back to the seller for anything. But if there's a fraud issue where the seller knew of potential problems with the house or didn't disclose ongoing problems with the house, then they can always go back after getting an attorney, and fight that situation. But it does. The next time you have an as-is clause attached to your contract, pay attention to the deed and just review it, because you'll see the language specifically added in there.
We had issues with that whole thing, so even with the as-is, like yesterday, we accepted our offer, and in the special terms, we added both buyer and seller agree that no credits will be, so it's an additional term that both parties have agreed. That way, during the inspection, they don't think, okay, well, there's an as-is, but we're still gonna ask for $3,000.
And you can still, right? I mean, if you represent the buyer,
Yeah, you
or
could.
you could, right? I mean, if you do your J1 inspection and there's like a lot of repairs, you can always say, hey, we'll look to close. And I know we said we weren't asking you for anything, but we weren't expecting this amount, for some repairs.
But in a competitive situation, if that special term is in there, we found that it works. They don't then come back to us and say, hey, fix it going on.
Wesley.
Is that the next 22 on the as is, the seller still has to disclose what's being sold as is, or is
No, you have to disclose,
Yeah, so,
right?
so it's a catch-22, it becomes more of a conscious suitor for the seller that, hey, we're coming in as is, but it doesn't negate or keep them from having to disclose to the buyer all of their known facts that they have, that they know about.
No, that's why I said, right, if it's like a situation of fraud, or they fail to disclose, then you can go back to the seller after consulting with an attorney, right? It's not up for you as a buyer's agent to go back and say, hey, you guys committed fraud, therefore, we need to prepare this. That's when, attorneys become involved.
So,
Yes, Dan?
To my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, as is only takes place at or after closing.
What was that?
As is actually only takes place at or after closing. Because prior to closing, the buyer can ask for everything is negotiable up until closing.
Absolutely.
So that's when you point it out, it's in the deed, that's what you want to read is the deed. That's really the only real place that shows up that binds both parties.
As long as there's no fraud.
Correct.
but as is does not eliminate, like to Russell's point, does not eliminate your need to disclose. That's part of the law. So SRPS requires it. One has nothing to do with the other. Run.
Just for compliance statement, can you mention what addendums are required by code?
Well, it depends on, it depends entirely on your offer.
The optional, that they and all of that. What is code actually required in the contract? Besides doing actually require our standard addendum.
Yes.
Okay, so
Well, this is
somebody
contract.
tries to do.
I mean, if you're-
Contract back and say, don't, we have to do that.
Maybe the language should be softened, it should be recommended, because at the end of the day, it really depends upon what the buyer wants.
Correct. Yeah.
Yes, we're recommending that we should put in this addendum as disclosure to you as a buyer, or the as is, or whatever it is. Again, the buyer can say, I don't want that in there, I don't want this in there. So it really defaults back to the buyer.
Or it's countered out.
No, what I'm saying is for Keller-Williams' sake, what, for compliance sake, in order to close the deed, what addendums are we required to have in there? Like, I've seen them where the standard addendum must be in there, otherwise it will close,
No, that's, I think that's
true now.
I think that's probably the job of compliance is to make sure that what you say is being made part of the contract is actually in there. So I think the issue that might have come up before is you've checked, not you personally, but as an example, right? The agent has checked standard addendum and there's no standard addendum. So compliance is like, well, you said this document is in here, so where's the document? And that might be where it went sideways because in other words, you shouldn't have checked that document. That document is not part of that contract.
So what is your final answer that we don't actually require?
It's recommended to submit all offers if you're on the buy side using that because it protects, it's a disclosure and it really does disclose and protect you and protects our buyer, what they're setting up.
We're all going back and say, where's this, where's that? But it wasn't part of the contract.
Oh, then in that case, if it's not part of the contract when it closes, it's not part of the contract, right?
Okay. So it's California standard addendum, therefore it's not required.
That's not what we said.
Recommended.
It's recommended.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
So, is it my understanding that we can do addendum, for example, photo transfer or locations, they have their own addendum? And I was told that either one is okay. But
Well-
before that, I know we had two companies addendum. When I was at the different company, they required to addendum their own and then other company wants their addendum.
So what I'm going to say is when you're representing the buyer, put our addendum in there when you write the offer out. Just kind of get in the habit of doing that. There's nothing bad in our addendum that protects you, protects the buyer. In certain circumstances, you might send it out and you get countered back. And they might remove that. They might insert their own. They might add their own. We have to get in the habit of reading the documents that are, because we're protecting our clients. So read them and make sure, is there any conflict in the language of the two? Keeping them both, is that a bad deal? I have no idea. I don't know, because it depends on which firm you're referring to. I would then, if you were literally in that situation, you know what you should do? Call your bid. Sit down with your bid, that's what the bids are for.
I mean, the in the KW standard addendum, it goes into like E1, right? Buy to verify square footages, schools, property taxes, so on and so forth. It goes into J1 inspection, you recommend a professional home inspector. We added in, we could represent multiple buyers, could represent multiple sellers.
Those are all good things.
So if you're gonna submit the offer, have the KW standard addendum signed by your buyer. If it gets countered out, at least your buyer signed it, and they've acknowledged that, okay, I know I need a professional home inspection, I know I need to verify all this stuff, whether it's part of the contract or not. If you don't include it, and they come back and say to you, oh, well, you didn't tell me I had to verify property taxes. See, if you had the standard addendum, even if it's not part of the contract, if you had it signed, they can't come back to you for it. But if you're not reading the contracts, if you're not reading the addendums that you're putting out there, chances are your buyers are not going to read it either. Just make them aware of everything. Yes.
So coming back to as this, I prefer to put it in for my buyer and seller.
That's fine.
Because when the realtor don't read it correct, that I didn't read line by line as this addendum actually exists really good points. So that buyer's expectation of seller has to repair everything. They might think twice about that, where they come from on that. But my question is, I think as this condition says that it was built according to the code at that time, but then today's code is different. Can buyers still request to bring it to a current code on some things?
So you're saying that the building code of 1945 has changed, this is done in 2020, and you're going to do a home inspection, and you're going to ask the seller to bring the property up to code? Absolutely.
And whether they sign it as is addendum or not, the buyer can absolutely make any requests they want.
Joe, you have your hand up?
I just want to repeat what you said, that our standard addendum is set up there. I think all the buyers, if you represent the buyers, you should have the buyers sign your standard. Regardless if it's going to be a part of in the counter or whose addendum you use. Because at least that way your buyer understands what's in your addendum and all of the scope. And likewise, if you're going to have a listing, you should have that standard addendum signed by yourself.
Right.
Because it's a disclosure.
As part of taking the listing.
As part of taking the listing. So always have a standard addendum signed by the client that you represent.
So
buyer or the seller.
So just to be clear, thank you, Joe. So just to be clear, there's two separate things, right? So get your client, have them sign that. It protects you as a licensee. Whether it's being part of the purchase contract is a different thing. There's so many other moving parts to that. Are there other offers? Did they counter that out? But get it signed. You have it signed nonetheless. It might be unilaterally executed versus fully executed. That's okay. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah, sure.
More than one buyer's contract.
It's inside of the KW standard addendum.
We recently updated the standard addendum, and that language for that form that was on its own is now made part of the new updated addendum as of December of 2019.
Yeah. The KW standard addendum does not change anything in the purchase contract. It's just like 6 or 7 different disclosures for both the buyer and the seller. And there's protection in there. So it's like, buyer or seller has not relied on any information provided by the agents. They hold the agents harmless, right?
Including the short-term rentals.
Yes, and short-term rentals too. Thank you, Joe.
Okay, if something is not applicable, this is going to section E2, contract. If something is not applicable, do not leave it blank. The purchase contract requires you to enter any in the space provided, and more importantly, make sure that all the items that are checked are in fact there. Right? Have you guys done that before? You kind of just assume that, and by the way, you can be copying the MLS too. But it's garbage in, garbage out. The MLS may or may not be accurate as well. So if you're writing a contract, I would say 99.9% of the time, you probably have been to the property. You show the property, so you know what's there.
And if you're dealing with a rental, make sure that the appliances belong to the seller.
So what appliances may not be
Microwave.
There's nothing like having to pay for an appliance that doesn't belong to the seller.
But you can still check it off if you're, even if it's not an MLS as a, you can still have that checked off and then hold the seller accountable for that, right? Like, there is no refrigerator inclusion, but you checked it off because you're buying one refrigerator, and you can still hold the seller.
If it's not advertised in MLS, and then you check it off, and the seller doesn't counter it, or the seller's agent, you can argue, hey, this, we asked for one. But then again, what do you get? You get a $100 used refrigerator, right? So then you start arguing, what kind of refrigerator am I entitled to, right? So I mean, in my case, with this, either be very specific, you give me a credit for a refrigerator up to a certain amount of money, or at a certain amount of money, or don't even waste your time and put something in there because you're not gonna like it. The refrigerator has to be working. Right? I mean, I tell you this stuff and it sounds ridiculous, but that's what happens out there, right?
On the list side too, I've been in a situation where spoke with the sellers. They intended to include, in my case, a washer and dryer. They were military and they were doing all their move out. And suddenly the washer and dryer left after J1. It just disappeared. And I ended up having to buy another washer and dryer. So you have to be on top of everything, whether you're on the buy side or this side.
A good practice that, and I learned the hard way, I don't get it wrong, but if the buyer's showing interest in an offer, I usually just like take some quick photos.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes MLS doesn't show everything.
Yeah, great point. So Zeus was saying that sometimes he'll take photos of the appliances that might be mentioned, right, on the MLS, even though the MLS might not have those.
Yeah, like in the MLS that you had out for the exercise, right? If you notice, the first picture is a washer dryer. If you notice, and what was included, the dryer was not part of it.
So in that scenario, great agents, as you guys are, I know you wouldn't experience that because you would call and go, hey, out of curiosity, I know this is, what washer was included, but dryer wasn't.
Yeah, one of the other was.
You would find that out, right? So E3, even though there's an owned PV system versus lease, use E3 to ensure you get a copy of all the documents, contracts, et cetera, that might be applicable to that PV system or plan. There's a handful of PV providers. Some of them are kind of, they call themselves like an owned plan, but it's really there's some sort of lease obligation. But more importantly, if you read this language in E3, it's asking for all those documents. So just make sure, sometimes I've seen it before where people will say, they'll check off the photovoltaic system, own system in E2, and then just not have anything in E3.
Yeah, that's really, when I went to a purchase contract seminar at HPI, they said specifically that part, like, if it's owned, just check E2. If it's leased, that's E3. That's E3.
Well, I would tell you specifically, if it was me, if I'm an owned system, I would check off photovoltaic system, E2, and I would also check off E3. If it's a lease system, I would only check off E3.
I know you said E2, they no longer have microwave. So we just put in other microwave for it and not for.
That's what I do specifically, is I put it in other. And you know, the other thing that I put in other too is if attached, as attached. Because if there's something that's a fixture that people kind of forget about as a filter in both cases, I don't want somebody trying to get it.
And also, the photovoltaic, we used to have an addendum.
Tell me. I know there are addendums.
You know, because I find that a lot of the photovoltaic companies are out of business, no longer should be located. How do we convert it if that's the case?
That's a great point. Maybe we could.
Yeah, I guess we'll have to get one. And that's probably the reason why you want to check E3 no matter what, because even though it is an own system, you know, in E3 it protects you as far as, protects your client as far as getting the documents for it.
Transfer.
So for instance, you know, it says in E3, so let's say it's an own system, and that company may or may not be out of business, to your point. I would check the photovoltaic system in E2, and in E3 would be checked. And you know how it says there's a line for other? You can fill it in as any and all contracts pertaining to however many panels of the PV system on the roof and all the equipment and so forth. You can write that in there. It doesn't have to only solely be the lease documents. That's why that E3 is important to keep in mind. Especially with the leases, because the leases get tricky here.
Well, the leases, you can pretty much contact them, whoever they're paying to.
Yeah.
But oftentimes the old ones, they're long gone already. And so there's, really no way of contacting them.
So to your point on the lease side, you want to make sure that the days, you have appropriate amount of time for the buyer to be able to review and all those other kind of things, because there are some companies, I'm dealing with a couple of them right now that remain nameless. They're tricky. Their contracts are a little bit hard to understand. It's not a flat fee for the equipment. It's kind of a discounted wholesale rate that moves up every couple of months. It's just a weird thing. So if you're representing the buyer, you want to make sure that you have adequate amount of time to review that document, because that might in and of itself kill that transaction, especially if it's like a VA loan or an FHA loan where it affects and impacts the debt ratio, because the lender will look at that too.
And then if you have a property with, like, say, central AC, swimming pools, PV systems, get professional inspectors.
Right.
Don't rely on a home inspector to go up there and like, oh yeah, the panels look good. The water's temperature is warm. Get the professionals out there for that specific, pieces of equipment.
So F2, which is the closing schedule date, you can have a certain amount of days. You can have the specific date, as we were talking about before. And if you do that, make sure you know what date it lands on. And then add and delivered vacant as per Tony's suggestion, which is a great suggestion. So out of curiosity, what would be, because again, it's not a right or wrong thing, but what would be a bad thing about sending something off with a specific date on there? Like if I wrote the contract in F2, I put February 15th or whatever, and assuming that it landed on the right day during the week, what would be the bad thing?
Take time, like, coming back and forth.
Right. So did you hear what she said? So I might burn a few days. So in my mind, I'm like, okay, we need 40 days or 45 days. That's what we need. And in that process, I'm going back and forth, and I might have eaten into, God forbid, 5 or 7 days, just countering back and forth and back and forth. And if that's a hard date, you just have to be aware. It's not a bad thing to put that date. You just have to be aware of what's happening and make appropriate adjustments. F3, before completing, check with the buyer's lender. So F3 is the change the scheduled closing date. Also know the days entered into F3A is a double-edged sword, right? So what's changed, does anyone know what's changed about this contract that was updated in May versus how F3A was, the verbiage on that prior to? So prior to, everyone had to agree. Correct. So it's unilateral now. And who can use it? Is it the buyer or the seller that can use it? Do you want to mention that one issue?
Yeah, so we just had an issue come up where in the counter offer, it said that either buyer or if either the buyer or the seller has not exercised F3A, then such party can go ahead and exercise that at any time. And why we bring this up is that the buyer and seller did 2 extensions to the closing using F2. And in one of them, it was checked that on the first F2, the buyer and seller both agree to extend the closing date, and then it said, time is of the essence. Then buyer and seller did another agreement, both of them signed off on it to extend the closing date one more time. Third extension comes up by the seller using F3A. And I went back and forth, and I don't know if anybody knows that when I get upset at the other side, like I get really angry and forceful, right? So I had like my bull horns went up, and Chad, Joe, and I were sitting down, we're talking this. And the guy says, look at the contract. Neither party used F3A. Therefore, the seller has the right to go ahead and extend it. And he was right. So when you see provisions like that in a counter offer, you got to really understand what they're trying to accomplish. And then maybe if that seller had to, extend the first time, maybe let them do it on the F3A. But in this case, the buyer's loan lock was expiring, and now this extension was going to cause him to have to come out of pocket another $2,500. And there was really no valid reason for the seller to extend other than he didn't want the 45 days starting on his 1031 exchange until 2020. Right? What's the real valid reason?
So is the seller responsible to pay for the buyer's loan lock extension?
No. But in the contract it says either party, as long as it doesn't cost, and it was written, as long as it doesn't cost the other party additional monies. Right?
This was 1960s.
It was, right? But then you get to the point of arguing it, and the buyer wants to buy it, he doesn't really care. So then he has to give him $2,500.
So what day should you, or how many days should you put in there? It goes back to obviously having that discussion with your client, the buyer. But the day that you put in there, just know that it can be used against you, just like you were thinking that it could be used for you. So if you put 10 days as an example, and you haven't, neither party has used it, and you're now just a few days away from closing, that lock expires, and then the seller just goes, oh, by the way, we're going to extend it by 10 days. Just know that that's why. It's because you put that amount of time in there too. So that kind of dialogue should be coordinated with the lender so that they know when they're locking, they're also having that conversation with the buyer too. Most lenders, if they're good ones, at least will typically cover those short-term extensions.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Also, if you have 10 days in there, and you only need 5 days, you take 5 days, you can't come back and utilize that after it again. So my recommendation is take the whole 10 days, even though you don't.
Yeah, or sooner. That's really what you can do. F4, if you aren't competing with another offer, use our title company or one of the partners that we have, First Hawaii Title. They're very good. E4, if furnished, so we're at E4. E4, if furnished, include your inventory list. And a little tip from Tony, it would also be wise too to include photos of what you're hoping to have included. All right, so the properties that are Waikiki that might be fully furnished, for instance, not only create a list, but include photos of them as well. Yeah, that is for E4, inclusions. Oh, you have a question about F4? Yes.
F4 says use American type of
Yeah. So that's a great point. So his question was on F4, where you choose who the title and escrow company is. On MLS, it says use whatever First American Title or whomever. Whose choice is it? It's buyer's choice, right? Is it?
The title is for the benefit of the buyer.
Yeah. So Brittany was saying
if you want to be competitive, you ask the seller what their preference is when in that initial phone call.
Yeah. So to that point, there's no right or wrong. It is to the buyer's benefit, but sometimes when you're in a situation where you're competing, you know, if if it's okay with the buyer, then you're gonna wanna write it to the request of the seller.
The idea is to get the contract accepted. Right, so escrow is the only one that they're gonna push back on, just take care of it up front.
F8, if you're on the buy side, if you're writing a contract for a buyer, you'll want to select seller on both F8A and B and write none in each of the blanks. So we were talking about that before for the assessments. And then of course, if there is an assessment, that as per the asterisk, if there's a known assessment, address that assessment in section Q. So that's on the buy side. If you're on the list side, if you know there's an assessment that the seller is currently making payments on, you may want to consider countering to have this prorate, depending on the circumstance, right? But make sure that you inform the other agent as to what that assessment is, how much it is, how long it runs through, what it's for, and so forth. As well as have the seller disclose it as such in the escrow PDS. F12, which is keys to the property. If the buyer wishes to have more than one set of keys to the property, please address that in E2, which is the inclusions. Okay. Moving on to section H1. If you're on the buy side, make sure that you enter the type of proof of funds, such as POF or proof of funds from buyer's lender. So out of curiosity, when you're looking at H1, if you notice on the bottom there, it says bank statement, verification from depository or other. What's some pros and cons about using the ones already provided, bank statement or verification from depository?
It can show the buyer's hand.
Say again, Brittany?
It can show the buyer's hand.
So she said it can show the buyer's hand. What? Same. You guys agree? It doesn't really help, right? So there's no wrong answer. Obviously, that certainly satisfies what the contract states. But a couple of things is you're providing a lot of information, a lot of personal information. So if in fact you do go that route and use the bank statement, you can make sure to redact all of the personal unnecessary information. But the reason why you wouldn't necessarily want to do that, that's not the best choice, is let's say that you're writing this letter and you're in negotiation and you're saying, this is all that we can afford. And then suddenly there's an extra $100,000 sitting in that bank. And that doesn't help for your overall negotiation. You want to try to provide as little information to the other side as possible while still meeting the necessary requirements for the contract. So one simple solution would just put a proof of funds letter from the buyer's lender. Letter from depository just means it's the bank. The bank is writing that letter. Now the difference is if it's on all cash deal, you obviously can go that route because they don't have a lender in that case. But most banks will typically write the balance. So again, you might be giving away a little bit too much information too. No right or wrong, but that's just a...
One more note is, maybe you want to have your lender put that in the pre-qual letter, or pre-approval letter, that I have verified their bank deposits. And then possibly, there's no right or wrong, but just, don't even have verification of funds. Because if you notice the language in it, is that the seller can go ahead and terminate the contract if he doesn't like it. For whatever reason, right? So if you just include it with the purchase contract and you remove it from the contract itself, they can't really say anything.
On the list side, so again, here's where I'm going to give you contrary advice. Right? So we talked about the buy side. The list side, make sure the type of POF, the proof of funds, the buyer's agent selects will be acceptable to the seller. So if you send me an offer and I'm the listing agent and it said proof of funds, I'd probably counter back and say bank statements. All right? So
You counter back in what?
I would probably, depending on the circumstance, but I might counter you back and require bank statements. For the exact reason that Brittany said I shouldn't do that on the buy side.
So for each one you're saying that you don't have to include verification of funds? Include it with the offer, but don't make it part of the contract.
I would say have the lender, when they submit the pre-approval letter or pre-qual letter, say that I have verified that the buyer has sufficient funds to close, right?
NA.
Just NA, just include it, right? As part of your pre-qual letter, but then it satisfies it. Yes, sure.
Contract. There's 2 paragraphs each one.
That's a great point. That's actually one of the things we're going to talk about too. So So Sean's question was, it says on the purchase contract in parentheses right above, choose H1 or H2. Right? Say that again?
But you don't have to do that.
When what circumstances would you not want to do
You can
that?
change any line in here if you, the client requested.
Okay, so her answer was you can change any line if the client wants to change it. What's another reason why you, you could follow that rule. I mean, it says it in writing, right? John?
I guess that's because when he said it, the loan officer puts that language in the people that it says verify the funds, and they go NA, each one.
So let me ask you this question. What if Russell?
Well, H2 is broken down into two sections. H1 is broken down into two sections. One is either there's no contingency on taking the cash. And the second part of that H1 is that whether or not they're going to verify the cash. So you can still be not contingent, like you still have money banked on contingency, and you can still not verify and mark NA as you're not going to verify what they actually have. You can still provide the information on the 20%. So you're not obligated to verify. You can check H1, because that's the happen. You put NA on the you can check like how they have it here. They check H1, but the NA the verification.
Are you included on the other?
As far as verification.
Yeah, like already included.
No, personally I don't do it because it allows the seller out. Yeah, that your information provided. I don't see it.
Dan, were you gonna say something?
Yeah, well, this new contract says regardless of how it's provided, the seller can not be satisfied. And that my question for Tony, do you have any past experience with a seller not accepting that?
No,
Not yet. It's
not yet.
Not yet, right? 'Cause
Not
it's-
yet.
It's not been tested yet.
But according to this, the seller can't, even if whatever you send,
You can send so his point, you can send the adequate amount. You require 70,000, you can send a bank statement for 100,000, the seller could say, I'm not satisfied. Here's what I can.
but if you eliminate verification of cash funds and they don't come back in a counter,
yeah,
And
the
then it
seller,
doesn't-
the seller can accept that.
I don't know. Like,
Unless you provide the information with your offerings, it's red fire.
Correct. That's clear. I would keep it separate, not in together, because the seller's agent, I want documents that are very clear, not muddled. So you're gonna want to have a letter stating from the lender that you have, he has verified all the funds, and also a pre-approval letter stating that you've proven all the things that you need to do.
right,
That makes it cleaner.
yeah.
It's not the easy route.
Okay, we'll talk about that. So I-1B, this is on page 6 of 14. I-1B on the buy side, I-1B, by the way, I-1B, you'll want this date as reasonably short as possible, right? We kind of alluded to that. Ideally, you want to receive the SRPDS so that you can forward it to the home inspector before the home inspection. Now, honestly, raise your hand if you actually review and forward your SRPDS to your home inspector. Just lie, just raise your hand. And then start doing that from now on, please.
I have another question. How many in here actually read the SRPDS when they get it from the side?
Well, guess what? We have our SRPDS class too that we created. So we've never had one before. I don't know why we haven't had one before, but Tony and I will teach that one as well. On the list side, it's recommended that you have the seller complete the SRPDS. When, Dan?
You get it right after you sign the listing.
Is that before it goes on MLS? That's a good idea. That's a really good idea. Yeah. And to Rustin and Dan's point, let's say that there's, because you don't know, I mean, you don't know what you're getting into and what a seller thinks might be a big deal or a small deal. They don't have any reference to if that in fact is true or not, or that's going to hinder the sale or hinder escrow or delay escrow, right?
It'll also help you with pricing.
That's right.
Because if there's anything that has to come out of that, that's gonna negatively impact the value of the property, you wanna know that before you put a number on the list.
So getting the SRPDS prior to listing, it'll help uncover any potential issues, concerns, litigations, assessments, et cetera, that you'll need an agent that your involvement to help remedy. Don't wait to solve the problem. Don't wait to solve the problem while in escrow. Also make sure that SRPDS is available as a supplemental document on the MLS. Some people don't do that. They'll go, oh, I'm not giving you that information until you make me an offer, until we go to escrow. Why would you do that? You want to make it available. If somebody doesn't want to write an offer because of the results of the SRPS or the findings that's disclosed on there, you don't want to go in escrow with that person. There's no sense in canceling an escrow. And you know, all of you know, right? You can upload those documents in a supplemental section on the MLS. If the buyer doesn't wish to purchase their contract based on the SRPDS, you'd rather know now than have a canceled transaction. I-2, on the buy side, you'll want the days as minimal as possible, just like we talked about before. That's the amended disclosure section. So you want that as low as possible. On the list side, it's kind of flipped. You want it as long as possible. So this is where we're attorneys and we're giving contrary advice. So it depends on what side you're on, right? And why? So you can have potential remedy by the time you find out that issue, and that maybe it's an AC that's not working. Or maybe you need to just update the SRPDS. But if you have it as low as, on the buy side, I would want it as like 2 days for I-1 or I-2, right? Maybe 3 days is kind of the most. That's kind of my rule of thumb. But what if it's on 2 days and it falls on the weekend? You can obviously still disclose, but at the same time, I would rather have a solution along with that problem. By the way, we're redisclosing. The AC didn't work. I already have somebody coming out to fix it, so it'll be done on you're solving that problem right away. Sorry, participating in our class here today. Okay, I-3A pertains to the receipt of the SRPDS. Tony and I were going through this the other day, and as many times as I have read the purchase contract, you've always learned something new. And it was great, right? Because Tony and I were reading it, and we both kind of discovered our own perspectives on how we look at certain portions of that. So you always learn new things, and I-3A pertains to the receipt of the SRPDS. I-3B pertains to the time to examine the SRPDS. I-3C pertains to the time to examine an amended SRPDS, which is amended by the seller. And a tip on the buy side, write your I-3C with 15 days for the benefit of the buyer, right? So I-3C, which is on page, at the bottom portion of page 6. And then the flip side, I-3 is seller-driven, while I-4 is buyer-driven. On the buy side, if you use 15 days, you have an additional 15 days to terminate the purchase contract upon discovery or an amended disclosure. Whereas if you're on the list side, you're going to want a minimum amount of days in I-4B, and to avoid such an extended time frame, the buyer can cancel. One option that you can do is attend the home inspection so you know what the pertinent issues are. And if it's not on the SRPDS already, you can have the seller add it and redisclose. For
essentially, from a buyer's perspective, at the latter part of the transaction, they're wanting to cancel, and the information that was found on the home inspection, they would technically, if that home inspection is given over to the seller, the seller will have to update the seller company disclosure. Well, sure, there's 2 days, one discovery and one updating. Right? So, provided the timelines fall that you're okay, if the seller says, screw you, I'm not paying you, then we'll fall back to discovery.
Which is covered in I-4.
Yes, it's not I-4.
The old contract used to have, the old contract, the provision in section I used to have either.
It was I-5.
Yeah, it used to be like either the seller updates it because they're aware of it, or upon discovery of the buyer. What they've done now, they've separated it. So while the seller needs to do it, if you're doing your home inspection and you don't make them aware of it, they don't know what to disclose. Or if they say, I'm not gonna go ahead and do it, discovery falls on the I-4.
Correct. So if you're that date needs to be long enough to give you calculate out.
Or do the buyer.
Or investigate it, right?
Do another inspection, maybe it's a leak and a plumber's gotta go in there. And I've seen it written where some people have it like 5 days or 7 days, that's not enough time if you learn of something new that could be detrimental, an electrical issue or a plumbing issue.
Oh, and then pay particular attention to I-2, because I thought this was pretty interesting, is that the last day for the seller to go ahead and amend the disclosure statement with new disclosures, 12 new before the date of recordation. I mean, like, wow, that's a little bit too late, huh?
Money's already in the bank.
So page 8, tip, general disclosures, lead-based paint disclosure is required as an added disclosure to all properties built in 1978 or earlier. Failure to do so is a $10,000 fine by the EPA per incident. So 3 missing initials and signatures, that's a total of $30,000 as an example. So people are a little bit loose with that for some reason, the lead-based paint disclosure. You should not be. Have you guys seen the handout, the EPA handout? You guys are all aware of that? What I do personally, and I would recommend that you guys do, is if you're dealing with a property that's built, 1978 or earlier, not only should you send out your lead-based paint disclosure, but also send out that EPA brochure in a PDF as well, and just attach a signature for them to DocuSign that, so it's together. So they can never see, because you can't, technically, if you read that document, that you had to have provided that to them. So it satisfies both. J1, and this is something that that Tony alluded to earlier, is if the property is older or larger, or there's some sort of special circumstance with that property, make sure that you have enough time for J1 to do all the necessary inspections, sewer, electrical, plumbing, PV, et cetera. And one thing that's done on Dan is if property is like 30 years or older, we make sure that we have a sewer scoping done, right? Because that's a major thing. And you can, on the surface, everything looks fine, but a sewer scope if there's a sewer issue that you have to replace pipes or whatever, that's tremendous. Especially if you're digging up concrete or, God forbid, it's in a CPR and that sewer line runs through that easement of the driveway, it's a mess. So you want to make sure that some people just think, J1, I'm just going to hire a home inspector and that's it. You really got to look and see, well, how old is it? Where is it located? What other equipment or other things are attached to the property that I might need to investigate, such as a pool guy or a PV expert or a roofer or what have you. So make sure that you have the appropriate amount of time in your J1. Something that I do personally is if I'm negotiating back and forth with someone and I'm on the phone, I'm via email, text message, you're dating, right? When you're with the other agent and you're kind of trying to make a deal work, everyone's getting along because you're dating, you're in the dating stage of it. One thing that I do is if I know and I have a feeling that we're going to go into escrow and they said, yeah, the sellers are going to accept and just waiting for them to get these signatures, I'm already contacting my home inspector and anyone else because I'm just letting them know, hey, I got this thing coming up. What's your availability? Can you just put a hold on this? And the reason is all too often I see you have a 10-day inspection and the inspection's occurring on day 8. That's not enough time. I mean, a 10-day inspection, the home inspection should be done on probably the 2nd day at the latest, maybe the 3rd day. But the rest of the time frame is not like, okay, we're like to Dan's point, we're satisfied to remove it. And it might uncover other things that would require additional inspections. So that's what you want to use that extra time for. A tip to avoid confusion, chronologically calculate your J3, J8, J9, and J10. I oftentimes see cleaning, final walkthrough, removal of items, all 5 days. That doesn't make sense chronologically. So one thing that might be helpful because TCs, Sherelle, I'm sure Sherelle can appreciate this when she's doing timelines, that it has a natural flow. So removal, as an example, you don't have to follow this exactly, but removal of items, 7 days, cleaning, 6 days. J3, final walkthrough, 5 days. That makes sense, right? J4, In Tony's example that we had before, I think it was like 15 days after closing. Never a good idea. There are rare circumstances. I think I might have used that once ever. So if a situation comes up that happens, you should talk to your BIC as to why you're checking that. But it really should be done within that time frame. So J4, avoid using any work completed after closing. This box should not be used unless you've spoken to your BIC first. And a tip, by J3, which should be at a minimum of 4 days, as Tony had mentioned before, prior to closing, all agreed upon repairs should be completed. And we kind of spoke to some of the reasons, right? Why that should be. You need enough time to protect your buyer so you can apply a remedy. And what did we talk about that, Zeus? What's the remedy if you do a J3, repairs aren't completed?
Escrow.
What can the buyer do? What's the option? What's the total options a buyer can do?
Get an estimate, escrow withholdings, have it. That's probably the most preferable.
Well, anything can be negotiated. So an extension, additional credits, or price reduction, can that happen? It can happen, but that's a fully executed agreement or an amendment, right? So you can do that, but what rights is provided to the buyer in the contract? That's it. That's the right that they have. That's the remedy that they have. So what Tony had mentioned before is when people put like 2 or 3 days for the final walkthrough, that's not enough time for that remedy to take place. You literally have to write the contract as though I got to pretend that there's going to be a problem. So I have enough time to maneuver to protect the buyer. A minimum of 4, but 5, yeah, sure. 5 is even better. Because especially if it's finance, there's a time frame of like when it's funding and the recording date, and you might have to put a stop on things if it goes sideways. Preston?
Oh, you're exactly right. If you sign one day, fund next business day, sit for a quarter, you have to have that thing solved by that 4th business day prior, like resolved. Or once the letter's funded, your client's going to be
And we had a case one time where the seller's agent actually went to the property right after the J3 was signed off on, and for whatever reason, it was still a couple of days before recordation, but the roof in the kitchen portion of the house had collapsed. So luckily, somebody caught it.
I had a situation too that's similar where a seller, by the way, don't do this, but if you represent the seller wanted to save some money. I represented the buyer. Seller wanted to save some money and shut off the electricity to the property. You can't complete a final walkthrough without that on, right? But they shut it off, and what happened was they forgot to empty out the ice in the ice maker. Electricity, the ice melted in the ice maker, and it leaked out for 3 or 4 days onto like wood flooring. And while the damage was only about 1 foot in diameter, the whole entire downstairs was that same type of wood flooring, and it was discontinued like 10 days or 10 years before. So in our situation, the seller had to file an insurance claim. It ended up being a $22,000 claim. So it was brand new flooring. So it's really, really important to make sure that you have the adequate time frame to maneuver for all those kind of things. So page 9, J8, entire property. You know that term, entire property, for cleaning. Do you check it? Do you not check it? Why or why not?
That's if you're a buyer.
Different costs.
So Zeus is saying if you're a buyer, Anya shook her head yes. Said yes, okay. Is there a reason why you wouldn't check it?
What's the entire property covering?
That's a good question, right? That's the question.
If you're on the list, I do not want that check.
Okay, so Zeus said if you're on the list side and you get a contract and F8 is checked with entire property, is checked, he's saying he would counter that out, right? Someone?
on the list.
So
Where does the entire property?
That's in J9 now.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry about that. It's J9.
Second.
Oh, so I'm on J8. Go back to your earlier question, the property's not clean, J4 applies, so it's 150% of
So that's
Cleaning
what
costs, yeah.
Yes, J9, my apologies. That's a technical word. So J9, right there has a little extra. This is something that's new per the updated purchase contract. Has a little box that says the seller shall have the entire property professionally cleaned with receipts included or provided. That's new. That wasn't there before. So to Erwin's point, what does entire property mean? That's the question. I don't know what that means, but it certainly can open up room for argument, right? So in other words, why deal with it?
Power washing, we've seen that.
So did anyone go to the forum when they were talking about this before the release? It was an open forum for the board. I think there's probably 1,000 people there. And some of the things they were talking about was this exact thing. And the problem was they had no answer. So the attorney for the board was also present. And he was kind of arguing with himself, to be honest with you. So the issue, and because it's not tested yet, it's not that we don't have precedent, we don't have cases it's just newly released. So the argument that some people had was, you could make is, well, you didn't have the gutters cleaned, it's entire property, right? You didn't have the driveway power wash.
Talks about that in J3, the walkthrough. The seller shall maintain the interior and exterior of the property.
Yeah, that's how they explain that.
So what does maintain mean?
So from when you saw it during your home inspection, condition that it was in, so like you're talking about gutters, if the gutters weren't clean, that home inspection, that's the same.
I would agree with that it should be in the same condition that the buyer last inspected it, which would be the J1, right? But there's also, but that's a different thing. But that's another kind of can of worms, so to speak. There's some verbiage for that. But that's why you don't want to go down that path unnecessarily. So if you're the buyer, one of the things that Tony and I were talking about too, if you're the buyer and if you want something specific performed for cleaning, for instance, the driveway power washed or the gutters cleaned or whatever, just put it in section 2 so that there's clarity on it. There's no issues, because you're just going to cause yourself some headache there.
If the house is clean and it's not during the final walkthrough deemed appropriately clean or adequately cleaned by the buyer, under J4, can they still retain 150% of?
That's what it says.
If it's not to the satisfaction.
Okay.
And also J9 was.
That's a unilateral decision of the buyer.
Could you repeat that? What was the statement?
His question was if the cleaning was not performed to the satisfaction, right, of the seller, can the buyer
To the buyer.
satisfaction of the buyer, can the buyer request a holdback from escrow to remedy that?
Doesn't say the satisfaction.
All you need is receipt, but you can find it in the contract.
I think it's criteria.
Right, professional.
That's properly clean.
OCD standard versus someone else's standard. You're not better on either.
Oh, J4.
That's why I said negotiate a credit at the beginning of the contract, right? Becomes part of the buy. It's up to the buyer to get it clean. If it is satisfaction, you go with the seller's agent, don't have to deal with it any longer. Or the buyer's agent, right? Because what happens a lot of times, they're not satisfied, we end up coming out of pocket.
So if you're on the list side, I agree with Zeus. We counter that out just because I don't want to have that room for an argument or anything later. So if I'm on the list side, I counter out the checkbox of the entire property to be cleaned. Not the cleaning, that's a point of negotiation, but the entire property to be cleaned, that check, as I have that with me.
But just for legal clarification,
There's no attorneys here.
J4 nor J9 include the term satisfactory, so as long as it's complete, then technically the buyer has completed his obligation.
It's tricky.
Because I've had an issue where the buyer says, we got the receipt, but it's not clean to our satisfaction.
Right.
Please come back or give us credit. And from what we're reviewing, you can come back and say, well, it was complete. Not to your satisfaction, I'm sorry, but it was complete.
That's tricky.
Yeah.
What was the question?
I mean,
It sounds like a law question.
his question was, it doesn't, the language in the contract doesn't say that the buyer has to be satisfied with the cleaning, just that the cleaning was done and receipts provided. So his question was, do they have a right to do a holdback, or do they have a right to?
No, because if they do, withholding only applies to the condition of the property in direct connection to the J1.
No, also with the cleaning. It says it right here.
It does go on cleaning.
Yeah.
But you know, for J9,
Tiff, go ahead.
for J9, it doesn't really say receipts, only if you check that last box. So
But it also says that seller's expense.
that's an expense.
Right, so what does that mean, right? Does it mean like I hired somebody? Does it mean I went out and I bought a bunch of cleaning materials? And I cleaned it myself, right? So, get very specific. So maybe in section Q. So to have a professional clean, right? I mean, it talks about carpets being professionally cleaned.
One of the things that I do when I counter back on a listing is I just say, reword this, and I put the seller shall have the entire property professionally cleaned with receipts provided, to the seller should have the interior of the property professionally cleaned with receipts provided. Just a for instance.
If we're getting really technical, J3 says in the same condition as it was inspected. So if it wasn't cleaned during day one,
Yeah, but the see, the cleaning is a different provision.
The J9.
The J1, the J1, right? I mean, it gives you just a little bit of added protection, but
J9 is a different.
you gotta argue it, that's the whole thing, right? Yes.
Only applies if the seller does not comply with this. So if the seller doesn't and provide the receipt by that time period before, it doesn't allow you, it only allows you for the seller to not comply within a specific time.
And it only mentions one, it just says cleaning shall do specifically.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily mean that they have to keep it was down or whatever else now. As long as they provide a receipt, then it triggers.
Right.
If they don't provide it, it triggers. If not, then it has nothing to do, it's only condition, not cleaning. Unless it's provided.
If there's no carpet, there's no shampoo.
Right, okay, so look how many different interpretations there are of the same provision, right? So this is what we as BICs go through all the time, right? And the BIC on the other side, they don't know either, because it's just really unclear. So there's a lot of gray area in the contract. So the best course is either in Q1, say I want a $500 credit, $1,000 credit, depending on the size of the property or whatever it's going to cost, or get it professionally cleaned to buyer's satisfaction. That's right.
The easiest thing is just to have it on it. So from the seller standpoint, we take it out. You're not gonna clean it up. From the seller standpoint.
Right.
From the buyer standpoint, you probably want to credit.
Right.
It's just easier. Because it'll be to the buyer's satisfaction. They can hire their own people with their own money, the seller gave. That's a clean.
I agree. Yes, Mickey.
J9 states that sellers that sell expense have the period of improvement on the property cleaning shall be included. Appliances, upward drawers, floor jalousies, screens, and windows. They don't even mention fan, if there is a fan.
There's a difference between cleaning and professional cleaning. Cleaning receipts for everything above. The only thing that's required to be professionally cleaned during this contract.
I have been assisting seller hire a cleaner, like, then if it's not true, they complain, they ask me about that. However, if it is a real high ceiling, that has to be in special condition, because I had cleaner come and they would do the high ceiling one because of the OSHA regulation.
Yeah.
So even you hire professionals, there's certain things they wouldn't have, because of the high ceiling.
Thank you.
Next one. Okay. K1, so I'm on page 9. K1 should not be used. This is commonly used on other islands in specific circumstances. On Oahu, as we mentioned before, we use K2. And as we were kind of going through this example here, K2, which is the survey, is not necessary for a condo or most townhomes. But for a single family residence, give yourself an adequate amount of time to have that received back. So again, it's all about remedy. Like how are you going to remedy the situation if you find a problem? So what kind of problems could you find on a survey that might throw the deal off or cause an extension or not being able to close on time? What's some of those problems that you can discover on a survey? Yep, it's an encroachment or an easement, right?
So on the condo, you don't check either K1 or K2?
You don't need it on a condo.
So you don't check, you have to check for K1.
Yeah, if it's applicable. So on some properties that have land, its own land, single family homes, a CPR, a PUD, some are kind of labeled as detached townhomes, but it really is kind of a single family home where there's fences or walls or things that could be owned by the subject property or a combination of the subject property and it's a neighboring lot. You can have a potential issue. So you just want to know who owns what. And those kind of questions should be asked during J1 too, or even when you're doing the showing. Is, hey, whose wall is this? Whose fence is that? You know, and also the condition of that wall or fence, because a lot of the if there is an encroachment agreement, a lot of the encroachment agreements are written such that if the wall deteriorates by a certain percentage, usually 50%, then the encroachment agreement could be dissolved. So you have to just kind of know where to do that.
If you're representing the seller and you're in an old neighborhood and the house probably hasn't changed hands in the last 40 years, I've seen it happen where a lot of the meets and bounds of the azimuths they take the measurements from are no longer in existence. So if that's the case, you want to call the surveys up front and say, hey, I'm in Kaimuki, I'm in Makiki Heights, I'm in such and such. How long is it going to take for you to do a survey? Because they may tell you it's going to take us a couple of months because we all got meets and bounds from like 4 miles down the road. So you want to know that before you get a contract and you go into contract with the buyer.
Can we bring clarity to encroachment just for the classes? 0.5.
Yeah,
That could be.
it says it in here.
Actually, we have a class on, we're going to have a class on specifically on that, on title reports, prelim encroachments and all that kind of stuff too. Because that's super, super important to Jan's point, but that's a class on its own. A tip, if you're not competing and in an area where the developer, so it's a kind of a newly developed area for the most part, the developer put up fences such as Ocean Point, some parts of Sea Country and so forth. You can still ask for the survey and you can remove it later during negotiating J1. Does that make sense? So in other words, if there's fences up and you can tell those fences are from the developer, you've already realized that they're from the developer, and maybe there's J1 items that you're trying to negotiate on, you can ask them, hey, I'll kind of swap you. We'll have the K2, the survey removed. And surveys, by the way, does anyone know how much surveys cost roughly? What's the range? $1, he says. About yeah, it depends on where it is, right? But a grand is probably a good average. 800 to 1200 bucks roughly. So it can get expensive. So if you have some other J1 items and you have K2 already accepted and approved in escrow, that's a good leverage point for you as well. But again, we don't want to include it in a townhome or condo because it looks like you don't know how to write a contract. Russell? Yeah. Don't assume that the other agent is as smart as you guys. Be smarter than the other agent. What I mean is I've written it like that on purpose, and the other agents just accept. They just kind of blow through the contract when they're presenting it to their seller, and it's accepted. And in my mind, I'm like, why did they even approve it like that? I wouldn't accept it. But now I have a room for leverage. So you want to get it accepted. You don't want to pepper all these kind of things in, and then they go with a different offer altogether. But just be smart about how you're writing it. Another tip is if a seller asks you to accept a previous survey, right? So that happens, right? You guys have seen that before. Maybe it's a survey that they got when they bought the property 4 years ago? Is that a good idea or is that a bad idea? Rustin?
We actually had one in Ocean Point that we did a survey. That's wrong.
Wow.
It wasn't, out of the hundreds that we got in there, that was the only one, which is probably for us typically.
That's a great point.
Just a couple year old.
That's a great point. Sometimes you might be in a competitive situation. I'm sure you guys have been there before where you call the other agent, ask if they have any offers, you're trying to negotiate that, and they say, well, one of the terms is you got to accept the seller's existing survey from 5 years ago or whatever the case is. You could, it's not unheard of, you can, but if you do that, you have to ask more questions. One of the things too is you got to make sure when you write in section Q, we're talking about the clauses, you have to make sure that they provide it to you in a certain amount of time, the buyer has enough time to review it, and most importantly, the buyer has adequate time to cancel and terminate based upon the findings of that the survey. Well, this is receiving an existing survey, right? So this is not a new survey. This is one that the seller had when they bought the property maybe 4 years ago. So the other thing too is you want to look at the SRPS to find out if they've mentioned any encroachments and what. You just want to do your math and kind of make sure things are adding up. Because if they said that they installed a fence or a wall or whatever, they bought it 4 years ago and they installed it 2 years ago and they're asking you to take a survey from 4 years ago, the answer would probably be no. Because there's a wall that we don't know where that wall, whose property that falls on, right? So you just have to make sure that you do some math and look at that.
And the K3 still applies.
Oh, K3 still applies, to answer your question too. Also, Tony also pointed out to check the prelim because there could be some cross-reference to easements, encroachments, and so forth on there as well. Another tip, right in, yes, sir.
Always ask the broker. I mean, hands down, there's never a take asking people.
Yeah, great point, President. And by broker, you mean Joe Piper. Direct all your questions. Another tip, write in who the buyer selects. This is something that we do on the team, which saves a lot of time, and it satisfies a requirement on the purchase contract, which is write in who the buyer selects for TIR in section Q. So that's just, that you're required to do that anywhere, and you need to notify them, so that just takes care of that right away. M1, you guys have ever seen where you've written a contract and they counter back to remove M1? You guys ever dealt with that? If you look at M1 in the purchase contract, there's no checkbox, right? So that probably would mean that it should not be taken out. Another tip, if you might consider adding something called a covenants inspection. This is kind of case by case, and I'll explain what that is. To M1, so in section M1 right here, see that little space where it says other? You can add something called a covenants inspection if it's a condo, a townhome, or in an association. Does anyone know what a covenants inspection is or why that might be used? Besides the, I'm gonna wait, because I know you know what that is. Anyone else want to take a guess? All right, Dean, what is it?
I think you get a little more detail.
That's a sad answer.
Where your association would come and inspect, make sure everything's permitted. If not, they would give you a
So that's good. So I'll reiterate what he said and I'll add to that too. So what he said was a covenants inspection is when you have the association go into the property. Now sometimes it's mostly exterior for the most part. Sometimes it's interior, whereby you're getting something in writing from the HOA to validate that there's no current violations or issues against the rules and covenants that property is part of. So I'll give you just a kind of an easy example. What if you're in a high rise and they have a window AC and there's no window ACs allowed, but they have one. So when you just go in and you're doing the initial showing and the J1, no one's telling you that that's in violation because it's there. So you think, oh, it's there, so it must be allowed. But God forbid if you close on that And the buyer said, thank goodness I have this AC, I would not buy this property if it didn't have AC. And then they find out later that the HOA said, you can't even have AC, so not only are we gonna fine you, but you gotta take that thing down. Who's the first person that they're gonna call? Hopefully Joe Pai. But they're probably gonna call you guys, right, as their agent. So what a covenant inspection is it kind of puts the seller on notice, but also validates to make sure there's no pending issues. Not all HOAs do that, but it's not a bad idea to include it so that you can make sure.
Include it to the pay for it too.
Yeah, so if it's on, sorry, go ahead, Russ.
General guidelines, and we've asked for that from inspection. What's been the compliance aspect of the condo association? What's the general timeline that you know, sense around that?
Every association in my experience is a little bit different. Big ones that are well organized, like Ocean Point, they, in my experience, they've sent people out probably within about 5 days of that request. But you know, you can put it here, but you can also address it in, remember we always talked about, for clarity's sake, you can also put it in section Q as well. But it's recommended, but here's the difference on a building permit package, because sometimes people think, oh, that's the same thing, right? You're just asking to make sure permits are there. A building permit package, does anyone use that and write that into their offers when dealing with a single family home? Sometimes? Does anyone use that for condos or townhomes? So what a building permit package is, you're finding out to cross-reference the records if you have an actual permit with the county. The county could care less what the rules are from the HOA. They might be in conflict. So it's a good, there are two entirely different things, but you just need to make sure you understand what they are and when they're used. But if you have like the example I gave, it's a one-bedroom condo and there's a window AC, likely you don't need a building permit package. There's nothing, they certainly haven't added on to the condo, right? But a covenant inspection might be a way to go for someone to consider.
So if you schedule a covenant inspection, you, the agent representing the buyer, will call the association, schedule.
I would already call just to find out if they even have such a thing and how one would go about verifying if someone's in violation, if there's any open violations or anything like that. It's not just that though, because if they could say, oh no, they don't have any open violations because no one's complaining. But there is something that's out of the rules that they could get fined for. So I would ask what that procedure is and how that, what they call it specifically. You know, 9 out of 10 times the way what it's called is a covenant inspection. Sometimes they have a specific thing. You work for a developer. Did SACO do covenant inspections? No. So you know how like there's some.
I mean, when it's new, it's all in the code.
Yeah.
All
But if somebody puts up like a shed that's 25 feet high, that's what I mean though. So if someone buys it, they put up a shed that's like this mega shed that's 25 feet high, that has a windmill on the top of it, that's higher than every other house. And you know, clearly that's in violation. Maybe no one saw it yet, but it's clear violation, right? So that covenant inspection makes sure that that's called out, that any fines are paid for by the seller prior to close, like those kind of things. That's the purpose of that.
That's a question. With covenant, in closing the lanai, we require covenant and permit.
Yeah, and so in some cases you need both.
Yeah.
So that's a great point.
I had one transaction where they had from the HOA.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an issue. So you have one, but you might be out of sync or out of compliance on the other. That's a liability and a risk that the buyer will then assume by closing on that property, so they need to know that. M2, and this is on page 11. M2, it's advisable to write the offer with, you know how there's 4 different things that you can check? I would recommend electronically formatted documents via email and internet address where the documents are located. Why wouldn't you choose hard copies or DVDs or CDs? What's that? Oh, she said liability.
You gotta return.
Correct, yeah. So you have to return it. So if you have sometimes, by the way, you have no choice. Like there's some association that all they do is give you hard copies. It is what it is. But you want to write it out with the ability not to have to get in your car, return something, and so just it's making it easier for yourself as well. Tip: if you represent a seller who is trying to decide whether to sell or rent, one thing that I have found successful is have escrow put together a net sheet and include the HARPTA or FERPTA withholding. That way they can get an impactful demonstration on what to do. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? So let's say you're representing a seller, and the seller goes, I might sell, but you know what, I might rent as well. And they're not an investor. It's not as though they have 20 other properties that they rent. In that case, they know what they're gonna do. They're sophisticated. It might be military, it might be a first-time home buyer that's relocating or moving, but having a net sheet provided to them with the HARPTA or FERPTA withholdings, they usually come to a clarification and they have a moment right then and there, like, yeah, I need it, I'm gonna sell it, I don't want to deal with this. So that's just something to consider. Commonly used special terms. So in the special terms section, it's one of those things that you want to use it when it's appropriate to do so. You certainly don't want to overuse it, because anything that's on there, I don't want to say is a red flag, right? But other listing agents, when they get it, they kind of go, I do this. I have a tendency to do this, in all honesty. If we're doing business together, you guys send me an offer and there's this, like, every single line is filled out, which if you notice, they reduce the lines. Every single line is filled out. That's what I do. I go, because it's all, I got to go through it, and I got to make sure that what are they writing. You kind of want to be, you want to check with your BIC as to what you're doing and how you're writing. Obviously, your BIC is going to be really important, but we don't want to inadvertently practice law without a license as well. So some people get a little too tricky with their words, and sometimes their words contradict each other. But what are some of the terms or clauses that we use in that section? The TIR selection, which I mentioned before, right? Who the buyer is going to use for a termite inspection. Building permit package request is something that's used. The two most common ones that I would think is used, in my opinion, would be escalation clause and an appraisal clause. Those are commonly used. Or clarification or anything else, removal of certain components of the contract.
Sometimes we see like somebody got to do a 1031 exchange, and they'll write the whole verbiage in the special terms, or a contingent sale, right? There are standard addendums on the internet, that specifically deal with those, those items. So don't try and recreate the wheel and type out something that no one else can understand but you. Use the proper addendum for it.
When in doubt, I see out.
So this is I don't know, it seems like a point of confusion for a lot of other firms in some cases. So the big signature on the bottom, or in Tony's case, the PV signature on the bottom of page 14, and the counteroffer page 2, is for rejections only. So I get that sent to me all the time. It says, hey, can you sign this? And I'll go, so you're rejecting it? Oh no, we're opening up escrow tomorrow. Oh no, that's for rejections. Right, so here's where some of the confusion lies, is I called the actual attorney for the board to ask them about that. And he said, well, you guys can use it however your firm policy doesn't use it. So here's what ends up happening is you might go into contract, and as you're representing the buyer side, you send it over, it's signed and it's fully executed in all the right areas, and I or Tony or Joe sign the top of page 1, and then they tell you, hey, can you sign the bottom of, have your broker sign the bottom of page 14. If you read the law, Hawaii revised statutes, and I even put that on there, or administrative section 16-99-3, it says on there that it's specifically referencing rejections. The other side might ask you to sign it anyway. Just tell them that's reserved for rejections.
It's also under T3 for a reason.
And to Rustin's point, this section right here, by the way, if you guys ever received a counter, make sure that T1, 2, 3 is properly notated. I and I think Tony and some other of you too, hopefully, if I'm on the list side and I'm countering back, I actually not only check T2 where it says counter, but we'll actually put the client's initials and date right by it too, just to add clarity that there is a counter that's attached to this as well. So on the buy side, if you notice, let's see, what section is it? Right here on the purchase contract, right here, it says seller is a foreign person, non-Hawaii resident, owner-occupant, or other. So if you're on the buy side, why is it important for you when you represent your buyer to know that? Okay, so HARPA and FERPA, but why? Why is that important? So there's HARPA. Now,
If the seller fails to pay, your client's liable.
did you hear that? That's exactly it. Can you say that one more time, Russell?
If the seller do not pay for the HARPA, then your clients are liable, as a buyer, your clients are liable.
So that's super important to know, right? So in practice, that usually never goes that direction, and the reason why there's escrow involved, escrow has them sign and fill out an affidavit, right? But those are important things to know. That's why you want to make sure that, especially if it seems kind of fishy, you know, I've done this before where the property is vacant, the seller said, oh yeah, the property, the seller's in another country or whatever the case is, if they don't live here, they're not. Write a contract with an expiration date of 5 days just because they're out of country, they live overseas. And then they put on here that they're an owner occupant. That's something you want to be aware of because to Russ's point, the law states that it's the buyer's responsibility if it goes sideways at the end of the day. So you just want to make sure you have clarity around that. Section T on the list side, I already mentioned that. Just make sure that if you're accepting it as is, you should probably always have a counter. If you're accepting it as is, it's appropriately checked there, not only the signature. If you're countering, make sure the counter is appropriately checked. And then, of course, add your initials. You can add initials or dates anywhere. The other thing, too, is if there's any changes that are made, I get this all the time, if there's any changes made to any document, whether it's a listing agreement, a purchase contract that's handwritten in, is that okay? Is that allowed? Can you handwrite something on a purchase contract? Okay. So that's good, just handwrite it and you're good to go?
No, it has to be done.
Yeah, so if you write something, it still has to be approved, it has to be approved both sides too. So if the buyer's sending it and they kind of jot, oh, okay, 500, okay, 400, and they sign it, well, there's still the other side that has to approve it too. So any changes or alterations on a contract have to be fully executed. So just make sure that you know that too. So a couple of tips before we wrap things up. And then you guys can ask as many questions as you want. Joe will be answering all the questions. Tip number one is it's imperative anyone working for you or with you have an active real estate license. So if you're a rainmaker on the team, like Rustin or Dan, or if you have a small team or you have an assistant, if they're doing activities that require a real estate license, they have to have a real estate license. You can't skip around it. That's super, super important. And in fact, it's so important, I copied the law so that you can look it up on your own. It is an actual thing. It's $1,000 for the first offense, $2,000 for the second, and $5,000. And this is per offense. You know, so make sure that you stay.
Or 40% of the total contract price.
So here's some questions. So question number one is, can an unlicensed assistant host an open house for a licensed agent?
No. Blind agency.
I say yes as long as you're not answering real estate questions, right?
That's up flyers.
I mean, if you're not, I mean, chances are whoever you have sitting open house is going to engage and talk about real estate.
Yeah, you can't have a conversation. You can say, hey, it's just 3 bedroom, that's her reservation.
Right. So you have to make sure somebody in there is not going to answer any questions whatsoever.
Or a sign that says, I'm you here.
Now, so to Rustin's point and to Tony's point, it's not a good idea to have an unlicensed agent be the sole person at that open house. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but could you have an unlicensed agent assist you at that open house? Sure, they can put out signs for you. They can hand out flyers. Somebody comes and goes, this is an unbelievable neighborhood. Is this neighborhood appreciating? Their answer should immediately be, oh, see that? They're talking about me. The handsome gentleman right there. Yeah, talk to that person. That person's a licensed individual. I'm not able to answer. You know, so you have to make sure that if you have an assistant, that you got to train them properly, because at the end of the day, they can get in trouble and you can also get in trouble as well. Sean, do you have a question?
So if I have a licensed assistant, I make sure they don't talk to my clients, but could they, it's related to real estate. So say I open escrow with a representing buyer, and it's a condo or something, I'll have my assistant call the association and a property management company. I want her to verify the parking stall number, maintenance fees, what it includes, if there's any other restrictions on different things. And she finds out those information, but she's only
They're not giving out information, that's the whole thing, right? They're taking information in, right?
It falls under my agency is between real estate and.
It is a slippery slope though,
Yeah.
you know?
Bottom line is get licensed.
Can an unlicensed assistant answer any incoming calls for you?
Yes.
Everyone's like scared to answer that. I legitimately, all of you answered the first question, and now I think 4 people answered.
If it smells like a duck, it looks like a duck.
What does a duck smell like? I'd imagine kind of bad. Can an unlicensed assistant write a purchase contract for you?
No.
Come on, I gotta get more consensus on that. That's an easy one. Let's try again. Can an unlicensed assistant write a purchase contract for you?
No.
Here's another tip. Another tip.
That's the answer, yeah.
No, no.
The answer is no.
The answer is 100% no. That is a no-brainer. That's absolutely, don't tell me that.
There's a world of
Tip number 2 is stay in your lane. And I get this all the time too, where an agent will call and go, I've never done a short sale before, so can you help me with my, then don't do that. You know, partner up with somebody that has or has experience doing that or what have you. You create a world of hurt for yourself when you start going into other areas. And the great thing about real estate, there's so many areas and levels of expertise that you can have, like Tony does commercial. You don't want to take on trust me, you don't want to take on a commercial deal that just because your client's like, hey, I'm looking for, you know, a commercial building, can you help me? Partner up with Tony. He'll split the commission with you. You're probably going to get a small percentage though. But, no, but he'll be happy to split the commission with you. You can learn, you know, in that way. The other thing too is don't practice law without a license. Don't tell people about, you know, tax consequences and so forth. Stay in your lane. Your license, you know, when people walk out of going through real estate school and they have their license, they're so excited. Like, oh my God, guys, I have my license. You know what that license is? That's a target. Now the state knows who you are, and that's the reason why you have the license. That's exactly the reason. So you got to make sure that you do things the right way because they know exactly who you are. It's a public safety issue. Rustin, did you want to say something?
Yeah, so under R1 and scope of service, we're not doctors, lawyers, attorneys.
Well, some of us are doctors. There's one. Watch your language. Tip number 3, write it down. Just like a physician or an attorney, licensed real estate agent should be taking notes. So doing a buyer consult, listing appointment, or a phone call, or doing a showing, write things down. And also, you know, something that I tell the team, and I tell all of my agents that are under me too, is that if you're going through some part of the transaction and your client is giving you instruction, like, yes, that's fine. Let's sign off on J1, the home inspection. Let's move past this issue. You know what? You're only going to give me credit for that. We asked for this. That's okay. All those kind of things are okay in that moment when they're verbally telling you. Send them an email just to confirm, because that's going to save you later. Hey, just, you know, Mr. Buyer, per our conversation, just wanted to reiterate what we discussed. You told me that you're okay with moving forward on J1 and we can sign off on both. Just confirm. They don't have to respond back, but you document it, you send it to them via email. Should you ever have a RICO investigation or, you know, anything else, you have this document that said you informed them. You know, reiterated your conversation.
And also do it with the broker on the other side. Because I've been in situations with, you know, conference calls and the agent says, well, I'll do this. And then when you confirm it in writing, it's like, oh, that's not exactly what I said. So.
Tip number 4, no templates. So silent right now. If you're using a template to write a purchase contract, stop it. If your files are audited and they find out that you've written the last 20 contracts exactly the same, clearly, it's clear indication you're using a template. There are some things that are kind of, you know, general. J1, in my opinion, J1, I see most often 7 days, 10 days, 14 days. There's nothing wrong with that if that's kind of what we use, but the other things have to coincide for you can't tell me that the last 20 buyers that you've had, every single one of them had the same exact goal and priority that would match up with how that purchase contract is structured. So you just have to take the time to make sure that you're asking the right questions. Now, if they all lead up to being very similar, but you have back to my previous note, you have everything documented on email and the conversations and notes taken, you're good. But, you have to make sure that you're filling out that contract to their own goals and priorities. Tip number 5, don't copy information from the MLS, whether it's for the buyer stuff, it has to be verified because that's all you have to go off of for initially, at least initially when you're starting to write that contract. You can verify those kind of things if there's an HOA, like on the HOA prior to writing it. On the list side, I get this all the time. I'll see a listing agreement, I look it up, and if they're copying the previous listings that are already listed in that area. Don't do that. And it's garbage in, garbage out. We don't know if that other listing agent researched it themselves. I mean, you have to do your own due diligence and check. So to this question, what should you do to confirm some of that data is accurate? If you're taking a listing, what should you do if it's an HOA? Call and verify, call the HOA. I think it's the last tip. Tip number 6, do a buyer consultation. The reason why I say that is listings are kind of, you have to typically do a listing presentation because it's you for the most, if you're not, let's do one. But usually that's kind of always happening. On the buyer side, what I see a lot is they're skipping right over that, especially newer agents. They just get so excited when a buyer's like, oh, I want to see this property. Can you take me to this open house? Or if you don't have a buyer consultation, you're really not doing them a good service because they need to know what to expect in a timeline. They need to know what their rights are. One thing that Dan is good at is he explains where in the contract that a buyer can cancel. That's part of their rights. They are owed that information and knowledge. Also, if you're dealing with a first-time home buyer or somebody that's come from the mainland or VA or whatever, where they're coming from might have entirely different circumstances. They might be coming from a buyer's market. This is a seller's market. He's from California. California is different, right, the contract. You have to sign off on certain, like appraisal contingency, you actually have to sign off on it. You don't have to ask past it. So you want to just do a good service to your client. Go through a buyer consultation. They'll appreciate it. And then you can set the tone for what to expect. And it just makes your life a lot easier. Because I also hear too, when people skip over that buyer consult, they're showing 15 to 25 different properties. And like, my guy won't make an offer on something. You need to sit them down and tell them like what to expect, how we're going to go through the flow of things. So it's really, really important to do. Lastly, before we let you go, what type of questions would you ask at a buyer consult? So if you're having a buyer consultation, what kind of things would you ask? What's a good idea to ask?
How are you going to finance the property?
How are we going to finance the property? That's a great question.
I'll go back to reward documentation.
Okay.
The market we have now in this era, everybody wants to also on the information about the deed, how my system and take those steps and also convert them to email and send an email involved and ask for a application.
I think it's allowed now, isn't it?
What's that?
She's saying that she compiles all her text messages into one format. I think that's acceptable. If I remember correctly, I think Kimo still the attorney I've used before.
It's like a call off, right?
Yeah.
You can have screenshots or email, whatever.
But there's nothing wrong still though with, so you're talking about like dialogue and correspondence, right?
It was after days, so I followed up with email saying, Jay,
Yeah.
discuss this.
Absolutely.
Please respond back if you receive.
And that's a great idea.
So it's in my file, and I have documentation besides mine.
And that's what I recommend. So even if you don't have to have them sign something necessarily, you don't have to have them respond back and say, received, I agree with everything you just said. The mere fact that you sent out to an email that you've already been corresponding in a dialogue with is sufficient.
One practice is you put the responsibility on that. I say, here's our conversation. If there's any variance to it, then please let me know. If not, we're going to consider this a mutually, this is a conversation.
And if they also, if your client or the agent on the other side send you an email with some information that's not correct, you need to correct them. That's not what we talked about. That's not the procedure. This is not included because we had a situation where we lost because the client assumed something and it wasn't true. And our obligation was to let them know that it wasn't true. Even though we weren't the ones that provided the information.
You put in writing what you want to say, so that's the bottom line.
So what other questions besides, do you need financing, would you ask at a buyer consultation? What's important for you to know? Time frames is one, yeah. That's a great one. That's location.
Kind of property to.
What's that?
Their why.
Their why or their motivation. Yeah, there's not really a wrong answer, but the point is you gotta be asking these kind of questions because it's only gonna help you more and kind of refine that a little bit. So